At 3:15 in the morning, on a quiet street in Chisholm, Minnesota, two teenage girls heard something they would never forget. A woman's scream choked off mid-sound, then an engine, then a dark vehicle with a topper pulling out of a driveway and disappearing into the fog. By afternoon, police would find Nancy Doherty dead in her own bed. For the next 34 years, her killer walked free. He raised a family 2 blocks from where he left her body. He worked, he aged. He watched Nancy's own children grow up without their mother because the technology to catch him didn't exist yet. Then, in the summer of 2020, a piece of trash in a dumpster did what 100 interviews and 3 decades of police work couldn't. This is the story of how a 34-year-old cold case cracked open, and why the man who committed it still had to be tried twice. To understand why this case haunted an entire community for so long, you have to understand who Nancy Doherty was. She was 38 years old, and in the small Iron Range town of Chisholm, she was the kind of person everyone relied on. By day, she worked as a certified nursing home aide, caring for the elderly. On top of that, she volunteered as an emergency medical technician, one of the people her neighbors would call first if something went wrong. She was, by every account from the people who knew her, warm, generous, and instinctively focused on other people's well-being before her own. In July of 1986, her personal life was mid-transition. She was separated from her husband, working through a divorce and rebuilding. She'd already made concrete plans for the future. She was scheduled to move into a new home on July 17th, and she was preparing to go back to school to advance her career. She had 2 children who were her entire focus, both attending the same Chisholm schools where, unknown to anyone at the time, her future killer had once been a student. On the evening of July 15th, an old acquaintance, a man we'll refer to as B.E., since his identity remains protected in court documents, came by her house to socialize. The two had history. Years earlier, they'd been romantically involved before guilt over her marriage ended things and he moved away. That night, though, they went out for a few drinks and took a drive around a nearby lake, the way old friends do when nothing's officially been resolved between them. Around midnight, he dropped her back home. He came inside briefly to use the restroom. They sat and talked at her kitchen table until she asked him to leave. He did, but only made it a few steps before turning back, using the weather as an excuse to check on her moving plans. Through the door, he saw her changing her shirt. He assumed she had someone else coming over, and he left. That was, according to every account gathered afterward, the last time anyone admits to seeing Nancy Doherty alive. At 3:15 that morning, neighbors heard a woman scream, cut off as if a hand had closed over her mouth. They saw a dark vehicle with a topper sitting in her driveway. Then it was gone. The next afternoon, when Nancy failed to answer the door for her own moving day, police were called for a welfare check. What they found inside would define this case for the next 39 years. But here's what almost nobody outside the investigation knew for decades. The man who left her house that night, the one with the motive, the vehicle, and the timeline was not the man who killed her. And figuring that out would take longer than anyone could have imagined. When Chisholm police arrived at Nancy's home, they walked into a scene that told a violent 2-part story, one that started outside and ended in her bedroom. Just outside her back door, investigators found a large patch of matted grass, clear evidence that a struggle, a serious one, had happened right there on the ground. Nearby, they recovered her keys, apparently knocked or dropped from her hand during that initial confrontation. And right next to that matted grass, they found something that at the time seemed almost incidental: a pile of vomit. Whoever attacked Nancy outside her home had been sick during the struggle. And thankfully, the responding officers in 1986, working decades before anyone understood the full potential of DNA evidence, made the decision to carefully preserve that sample anyway. The assault then moved inside. Nancy's body was found on her bed, unclothed, partially covered by a comforter. Her clothes were damp and covered in grass clippings, and grass was found directly on her body, physically connecting the struggle outside to what happened in that bedroom. The medical examiner's findings were stark. Abrasions were concentrated on her neck and clavicle. No defensive wounds were found on her arms or hands, suggesting the assault happened fast, and that she had limited ability to fight back once it began. The cause of death was ruled asphyxiation from manual strangulation. The manner of death, homicide. But it was the internal examination that would ultimately matter most 34 years later. A vaginal swab detected the presence of spermatozoa deposited within 48 hours of her death. The medical examiner also collected fingernail scrapings From these two sources, the intimate swabs and the scrapings under her nails, technicians extracted a single uncontaminated male DNA profile. Combined with the vomit sample recovered outside, investigators now had two independent, high-quality biological sources tied to the same attacker. Whoever left that vomit in the yard was the same man whose DNA was inside her body. It was, in forensic terms, about as strong a case as circumstantial and biological evidence could offer. There was just one problem. In 1986, there was no database to check that DNA against. No national system, no way to search for a name. All investigators had was a genetic fingerprint and no way to read it, so they turned to the next best thing, the people who knew her, and almost immediately, one name rose to the top of the list. For over 3 decades, the primary person of interest in Nancy Doherty's murder was not Michael Carbo. It was B.E., the same man who had dropped her home hours before her death. The reasons investigators focused on him were substantial. B.E. had been romantically involved with Nancy in the past, and by his own admission to police, he never fully let go of those feelings. He'd been sending her letters increasingly intense, increasingly possessive. In one, he wrote a line that would follow him for the rest of his life. "There are also times I think about you and I get so mad I could wring your neck." 2 months before the murder, B.E. had visited Chisholm and seen another man's vehicle parked outside Nancy's house. He later admitted to investigators that the sight had hurt him deeply and that he suspected she was seeing someone new. Then there was the vehicle. B.E. owned a gray Ford Bronco 2 with a topper, a description that lined up disturbingly well with what the neighbor's daughter and her friend reported seeing in Nancy's driveway at 3:15 that morning. And early forensic testing on pubic hairs recovered from the bedroom carpet suggested B.E. as a potential biological source. Perhaps most unsettling of all was something B.E. told investigators years into the investigation, a statement that reads less like a denial and more like a confession to himself. "You know, the human mind is a strange thing, and I've often wondered, geez, did I wake up in the middle of the night, drive over here and kill her? Go back to bed and not know it? Motive, opportunity, a matching vehicle, trace hair evidence, on paper, B.E. looked like exactly the kind of suspect a detective dreams of finding. But there was one thing standing in the way of an arrest. The actual DNA from the crime scene, the semen, the fingernail scrapings, the vomit, didn't match him, not even close. Investigators were stuck holding a suspect who fit every circumstantial detail of the crime and physical evidence that stubbornly refused to confirm it. Without a match, they had no legal basis to charge him, and so B.E. remained a shadow hanging over the case for decades. Someone everyone suspected, but no one could ever actually convict, which meant the real killer, whoever he was, wasn't just getting away with murder, he was getting away with it while an innocent man carried the public suspicion in his place. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the investigation ground forward the only way it could, person by person. Detectives interviewed over 100 individuals connected to Chisholm in 1986. They collected blood and DNA samples from as many local men as they could reasonably justify testing. Every single one came back negative. In the summer of 2002, the case got a second wind. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's newly formed cold case unit, working alongside Chisholm Police and the St. Louis County Sheriff's Office, officially reopened the file. This time they had a new tool, short tandem repeat, or STR DNA testing, a more advanced method that could pull clearer profiles from degraded biological evidence. It was a genuine technological leap forward. It still wasn't enough. In 2006, the case was featured on Minnesota's Spotlight on Crime program, and the reward for information climbed to $50,000. Detectives used the renewed publicity to run another wave of interviews, collecting DNA from more than 100 men who had lived in or passed through Chisholm around the time of the murder. Still nothing. And here's the part that makes this stretch of the investigation particularly frustrating in hindsight. The man they were looking for, Michael Allen Carbo Jr., was never on that list. He had no criminal record, nothing that would have flagged him for a national database. He hadn't been considered a person of interest during the original 1986 canvass of the neighborhood. He was, as far as the case file was concerned, a complete unknown, a man living quietly less than a mile from where Nancy died, going entirely unnoticed while over 100 other men had their DNA tested in his place. By the late 2000s, the case went cold again, genuinely cold. The kind of cold where families stop expecting a phone call. What nobody could have predicted was that the answer wasn't going to come from another round of interviews or another sweep of local men. It was going to come from a private consumer DNA website, the same kind of service people use to find out where their ancestors came from. By 2019, a new investigative method had started quietly transforming cold cases across the country: Forensic Investigative Genetic Genealogy, or FIG, and in the fall of that year, the Chisholm Police Department contracted with Parabon Nanolabs to apply it to Nancy Doherty's case. Here's what made this different from everything that came before. Standard forensic DNA testing, the kind used since the 1980s, looks at roughly 20 specific locations, or loci, in a person's genetic code. It's incredibly precise for confirming a match once you already have a suspect. But it's essentially useless for finding one unless that suspect's profile already sits in a criminal database like CODIS, and Carbo's profile was never in CODIS, because he'd never been arrested for anything requiring a sample. FIG works differently. In December 2019, the BCA sent the preserved crime scene DNA to a specialized lab called Isogen, which generated what's known as a high-density SNP profile, a genetic readout examining somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million individual points across the genome compared to the 20 loci in standard testing. That density of information doesn't just confirm whether two profiles match, it can measure exactly how much DNA two people share, enough to calculate whether someone is a second cousin, a great aunt, or a half-sibling of an unknown suspect. Once that profile existed, Parabon uploaded it to public genealogy databases like GIDmatch and Family Tree DNA, the same platforms ordinary people use out of curiosity about their own ancestry. Leading the search was C.C. Moore, one of the most prominent genetic genealogists working in forensics today. Her team began identifying genetic relatives of the unknown crime scene DNA, calculating shared centimorgan values, and reconstructing family trees branch by branch, generation by generation. They traced common ancestral couples, they mapped descendants down through the decades, and eventually all of those branches converged on the Iron Range of Minnesota and on a single name, Michael Allen Carbo Jr. At the time of the murder, Carbo had been 18 years old. He lived less than a mile from Nancy's home. He had attended Chisholm High School at the same time as her own children. He had, in every practical sense, been hiding in plain sight for over 3 decades. There was just one catch. A genealogy report, no matter how convincing, isn't evidence a prosecutor can bring into a courtroom. It's a lead, a very strong one, but still just a lead, to turn 34 years of silence into an arrest. Investigators needed something a jury could actually see: Carbo's own physical DNA collected the old-fashioned way. On July 23, 2020, BCA Special Agent Girardi set up surveillance outside Carbo's apartment at 310 Fifth Street in Chisholm. At 1:46 that afternoon, Girardi watched Carbo walk out, carrying 3 plastic garbage bags, and drop them into the communal dumpster serving his apartment complex. The moment Carbo was gone, Girardi retrieved those bags. Inside, alongside personal mail confirming the trash belonged to Carbo, investigators found the kind of everyday discarded items that carry DNA without anyone thinking twice about it: paper towels, facial tissues, cotton swabs, a beer can, an empty Slim Fast bottle. The BCA lab extracted DNA from those items and ran a standard STR profile. On July 24th, the results came back. The profile from Carbo's garbage was identical to the DNA recovered from Nancy Doherty's body and to the vomit sample preserved next to her keys 34 years earlier. But investigators still needed one more step to make the case airtight in court: a direct reference sample collected with Carbo's own knowledge and consent, so there could be no argument later about contamination or coincidence. On July 29th at 8:40 in the morning, Chief Vern Manor and Agent Girardi visited Carbo at his apartment. They told him they were collecting samples from local residents as part of a general elimination process. Technically true, if carefully incomplete. Carbo agreed and provided a voluntary buccal swab. The BCA lab prioritized the testing. By nightfall that same day, the results were in: a flawless, unambiguous match. Michael Allen Carbo Jr. was arrested and booked for the murder of Nancy Doherty, 34 years and 3 days short of 35 years after her death. For Nancy's daughter Gina Haggard, who had spent decades pushing for answers, it should have been the end of the story. But the legal system was about to prove that solving a case scientifically and closing it legally are two very different things. In April 2022, a St. Louis County grand jury indicted Carbo on 2 counts of first-degree murder committed during criminal sexual conduct. His defense, led by attorney John Douglas Schmid, moved quickly to attack the case on 2 fronts. First, they argued that both the genealogical database search and the dumpster search violated Carbo's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. The court disagreed on both counts, ruling that Carbo had abandoned any expectation of privacy the moment he left his semen at a crime scene, and separately the moment he placed his trash in a shared, communal dumpster. Second, and this is the part that would matter enormously, 2 years later, the defense tried to introduce evidence about B.E. as an alternative perpetrator. They pointed to his obsessive letters, his presence at the scene that night, his matching vehicle, and the pubic hair evidence potentially tying him to the bedroom. The district court denied this motion, ruling that the evidence didn't have a sufficiently strong, inherent tendency to connect B.E. to the actual killing. With that evidence excluded, Carbo's defense was left with a difficult, narrow argument. They claimed Carbo, who admitted to drinking and using drugs that night, had a consensual sexual encounter with Nancy, then left, after which some unknown third party entered her home and killed her. The jury didn't buy it. In August 2022, Carbo was convicted on both counts. On September 30th, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 17 years, a term dictated by the sentencing laws in place back in 1986, the year of the crime. For Nancy's family, it felt like closure, 36 years in the making. But Carbo's legal team wasn't finished, and what happened next would force this entire case to be fought all over again. Not because the science was wrong, but because of a question buried much deeper in the American legal system. Does a defendant still have the right to point at someone else, even when the DNA evidence against him is airtight? Carbo appealed directly to the Minnesota Supreme Court. On May 8, 2024, the court issued a ruling that was split right down the middle, and it changed everything. On the DNA question, the court sided completely with the prosecution. The justices affirmed that Carbo had no reasonable expectation of privacy in DNA abandoned at a crime scene, nor in trash placed in a shared dumpster. The scientific foundation of the case was untouched, but on the second question, the exclusion of B.E. as an alternative suspect, the court reversed the conviction entirely. The justices found that the original trial court had held Carbo's evidence about B.E. to what they called an unobtainable legal standard. Under the Sixth Amendment, a defendant has the right to present a complete defense, and because the evidence connecting B.E. to the scene, his motive, his letters, his matching vehicle, his potential hair match, genuinely had the tendency to point toward another person, excluding it entirely wasn't a minor technical error. It was a constitutional one. The case was sent back for a full retrial. For Gina Haggard and her family, the news landed like a second tragedy stacked on top of the first. The man who killed her mother had been convicted, sentenced, and was serving life in prison. And now, because of a legal technicality about how much of the case a jury was allowed to hear, they would have to do it all again. Testify again, relive the crime scene details again in open court, in front of strangers, one more time. The retrial would be different in one crucial way. This time, the jury would hear everything, including the case against B.E. The second trial began on January 13, 2025 in Virginia, Minnesota. And for the first time, jurors heard the full picture. Not just the DNA evidence against Carbo, but the entire alternative suspect narrative the first jury never got to consider. B.E. was called to testify. Jurors heard his letters read aloud, including the line about wringing her neck. They heard about his vehicle, his presence at the scene hours before the murder, and his unsettling comment about wondering whether he killed her in his sleep. On paper, it was a compelling case for reasonable doubt, but the prosecution, led by Christopher Flory, had an answer for every piece of it. Because while B.E.'s pubic hair was a potential match, Carbo's DNA was a certain one. Prosecutors laid out, methodically, that Carbo's genetic material wasn't limited to a single ambiguous sample. It was present in the intimate swabs from Nancy's body. It was present in the fingernail scrapings, consistent with a struggle, not a calm encounter, And critically, it was present in the vomit found next to her dropped keys and the matted grass outside her back door at the exact spot where a violent physical confrontation had clearly taken place. Carbo took the stand himself. He admitted he had no memory of that night due to intoxication, but insisted that if his DNA was present, it must have come from a consensual encounter. It's a defense that's become increasingly common in genetic genealogy cases when a suspect can't deny the biological match. The only remaining argument is to reframe what that match means. But the jury wasn't persuaded. A consensual encounter doesn't explain why the man's vomit ended up next to the victim's dropped keys on a patch of torn-up grass. It doesn't explain fingernail scrapings consistent with a fight for survival. On January 31, 2025, after a 3-week trial, the jury once again found Michael Allen Carbo Jr. guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. This time, there would be no path back to another appeal on this issue. The jury had heard everything, every letter, every alternative theory, every piece of circumstantial evidence about BE, and still convicted Carbo based on the physical evidence that had never once wavered across nearly 4 decades. On October 16, 2025, Judge Robert C. Friday handed down the sentence, life in prison, with parole eligibility after 17 years, governed once again by the sentencing statutes in place back in 1986, decades before Minnesota raised its minimum standard for life sentences to 30 years. Credited with 1,906 days already served, Carbo will become eligible to apply for parole in 2037, when he'll be roughly 71 years old. Even at final sentencing, Carbo maintained his innocence, telling the court directly, "You got the wrong person. I am innocent of this charge. I did not kill Ms. Doherty." For Gina Haggard, the moment brought no simple sense of victory. Having to testify twice, relive her mother's murder twice, meant the wound never fully closed the first time before it was reopened. In her own words following the second sentencing, "It was a shock to go through a new trial. I had to live the tragedy again. I have new anger to deal with. I have new scars to deal with. I will think of her every day, but not be able to talk to her, not be able to hug her. That's not enough." For law enforcement, though, the resolution stood as vindication for decades of work that many had quietly assumed would never pay off. Chief Vern Manor and BCA officials pointed to a simple but powerful truth underpinning the entire case. None of the genetic genealogy breakthroughs in 2020 would have mattered if the original responding officers in 1986 hadn't carefully preserved that vomit sample outside Nancy's back door, decades before anyone understood what DNA evidence could someday become. The Nancy Doherty case sits at a genuinely rare intersection of forensic science and constitutional law. On one hand, it's one of the clearest demonstrations of what genetic genealogy can do, bypassing the structural limits of a national database like CODIS entirely, using consumer ancestry websites to reconstruct a family tree branch by branch until it points directly at a man who was never once a suspect in 34 years of traditional police work. On the other hand, it's a case that reveals just how fragile even the strongest scientific evidence can be inside a courtroom if the process around it isn't constitutionally sound. A 1 in a billion DNA match wasn't enough by itself to guarantee a final conviction. The Minnesota Supreme Court made clear that even overwhelming physical evidence doesn't erase a defendant's right to point at someone else, and that getting that balance wrong can undo years of investigative work in a single ruling. In the end, both truths held at once. The science was right, and the process eventually was too. It just took 2 trials, 1 Supreme Court reversal, and 39 years for both of those truths to finally align. If a 34-year-old cold case built entirely on a preserved sample of vomit and a family tree on a genealogy website surprised you, there's another case where investigators used this exact same method to catch someone who'd been hiding in plain sight for even longer, and the way they finally closed in on him is even harder to believe. Go watch that one next. October 3rd, 1984, a 9-year-old girl in a quiet farm town north of Toronto gets off her school bus, walks up a long gravel driveway, drops her backpack on the kitchen counter, and disappears. When her family gets home an hour later, nothing seems wrong, until they notice the small things. Her dog is frantic, her bike is knocked over, and her jacket is hanging on a hook far too high for a child to reach. Police would spend the next 11 years chasing the wrong man. They would convict an innocent neighbor, destroy his life, and let the real killer walk free, a man so close to the family that Christine called his wife Auntie Heather. It would take 36 years and a piece of technology that didn't exist in 1984 to finally reveal who was really behind Christine Jessup's murder. And the answer had been sitting in the police file the entire time. To understand how this case went so catastrophically wrong, you have to start with a family already under enormous strain. In the autumn of 1984, Bob Jessup, Christine's father, was sitting in the Toronto East Detention Center serving an 18-month sentence after misappropriating funds from a special needs relative. That left his wife Janet alone to raise Christine and her adopted older brother, Kenny, in the small rural hamlet of Queensville, Ontario, a house the family had only found because Christine's grandfather happened to spot it for sale while they were going through financial hardship. Christine herself was, by every account, a bright and energetic kid. She loved animals, excelled in school, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian one day. But on the morning of October 3rd, she was in tears because her mother had decided she was too young to come along on the drive to visit her father in detention. Christine begged to go. She lost, and so upset, she was put on the school bus like any other day. Nothing about the rest of her day suggested anything was wrong. At school, she was handed a plastic recorder, a small woodwind instrument which she carried proudly onto the bus home. She was dropped off near her house in the mid-afternoon, walked up that long driveway, let herself into the unlocked farmhouse, and set her backpack down. With time before her mother and brother returned, she walked to the local corner store, bought bubble gum between 3:30 and 4:00 p.m., and left. She was supposed to meet a school friend at a nearby park shortly after. She never showed up. That gap, the walk from the variety store to wherever she was supposed to be next, is the exact window in which Christine Jessup was taken. When Janet and Kenny got home just after 4 p.m., the scene inside the house told a story, if anyone had known how to read it properly. Christine's beagle Freckles was pacing and distressed. In the garage, her red bicycle was on its side, its kickstand damaged unusual, because she always parked it upright against the freezer, and in the entryway her jacket was hanging on a hook far higher than a 9-year-old could reach on her own. Someone had been in that house after Christine came home. Someone had hung up her coat like they lived there. But here's the part that should stop you cold. At that exact moment, a piece of physical evidence was sitting in that kitchen that could have ended this entire investigation in days. The daily newspaper had been brought inside before the abduction, meaning whoever intercepted Christine may have touched its plastic wrapping. It was evidence that could have carried fingerprints, maybe even touched DNA decades before that science existed, and it was simply thrown away. That single careless mistake was about to become the first domino in one of the worst miscarriages of justice in Canadian history. For nearly 3 months, Christine Jessup was simply gone. Then, on December 31st, 1984, a local resident named Fred Patterson was out searching for his dog with his 2 daughters in a wooded rural tract in Sunderland, roughly 55 kilometers east of Queensville. Near a shallow, half-dug pit off the bend of a trail, he found something that didn't belong there. It was Christine. The evidence recovered at the scene was heartbreaking in its precision. There was the plastic recorder, the same one she'd been given at school on the day she vanished, with her name inscribed on it. There were tattered fragments of the clothing she'd worn that day. There was a single hair caught in the clasp of her necklace, and there was something else, degraded semen stains on her undergarments, evidence that decades later would become the single most important clue in the entire case. The post-mortem revealed that Christine had been sexually assaulted before she was killed by multiple deep stab wounds to the chest, some severe enough to strike the vertebrae. There was bruising consistent with the struggle, but no signs of strangulation. Here's the problem investigators faced in 1984. DNA fingerprinting as we understand it today essentially did not exist yet. Because the body had been exposed to 3 months of harsh weather and wildlife, the semen evidence could only be tested using basic blood group serology, a technique so broad it could rule almost nobody out. The one piece of evidence capable of identifying the real killer was for the moment useless. With no forensic path forward, investigators did what desperate investigators too often do. They stopped looking for evidence and started looking for a person who simply felt wrong to them. On February 14, 1985, the investigation turned toward 25-year-old Guy Paul Morin, the Jessup's next-door neighbor, a furniture factory sander and amateur clarinet player. And the reason his name came up wasn't physical evidence. It wasn't an alibi problem. It was a single line from Janet Jessop, describing him as a weird-type guy. From that moment, investigators built their entire theory around a personality, not a fact. Morin was introverted. He didn't join the community searches for Christine. He didn't attend her funeral. To the detectives working the case, that silence read as guilt. When he gave vague, philosophical answers during questioning, the kind and anxious, socially awkward man might give under pressure. They called it consciousness of guilt. There was one enormous problem. Morin had a time card. His workplace record showed he didn't leave his job in Newmarket until 3:32 p.m. on October 3rd. For him to be the killer, he would have needed to drive home, intercept Christine, drive 55 kilometers to Sunderland, commit the murder, and be home by the time his family confirmed he arrived. Somewhere between 500 and 5:30 p.m. Mathematically, it didn't work. So investigators went back to the one part of the timeline that was flexible. The Jessop's own marriage. Janet and Kenny had originally and consistently said they returned home from the dentist around 4:10 p.m., finding Christine's backpack, but no Christine. That timeline protected Morin, but after repeated conversations with detectives, conversations that should never have happened the way they did, the family's recollection shifted. Their estimated arrival time stretched to 4:35 p.m., and just like that, a window of opportunity was created that didn't exist in the original account. Morin was arrested on April 22, 1985, and charged with first-degree murder. An innocent man's life was about to be destroyed because of an offhand comment and a manufactured window of time. But the deeper failure here goes back even further to the hours right after Christine vanished, when the people meant to protect the evidence in that house were the ones destroying it. Because Christine was abducted in York Region, but her body was found in Durham Region. Control of the case shifted between two separate police forces. That single administrative detail triggered a cascade of institutional friction, poor communication, competing jurisdictions, and investigative records that were mishandled or never properly shared. But the deeper failure happened inside the Jessop home itself, within hours of Christine's disappearance. York Regional Police at the time had roughly one officer for every 860 residents, and no dedicated major crimes unit. Nothing close to the resources needed for a child abduction case. Officers entered the house through multiple doors. They physically handled evidence, including removing Christine's jacket from that too-high hook without preserving how or where it was found. Neighbors and family friends wandered freely through the kitchen, and that newspaper wrapping, the one item that might have carried the killer's fingerprints, was thrown in the trash, never dusted. On top of the physical contamination, detectives sat with the grieving Jessop family and openly discussed their suspicions and theories about who might be responsible. That kind of exposure doesn't just shape an investigation, it can quietly reshape a family's memory of events without anyone realizing it's happening. Every one of these failures fed directly into the case against Guy Paul Morin, and when it finally reached a courtroom, those same failures were about to be dressed up as science. Morin's first trial began January 7, 1986 in London, Ontario. Oddly, alongside arguing his innocence, the defense also introduced an insanity argument presenting psychiatric opinions suggesting Morin suffered from schizophrenia, a strategic hedge that reflects just how thin the actual evidence against him was. On February 7, 1986, the jury acquitted him of first-degree murder. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The Attorney General of Ontario appealed the acquittal, something only legally possible on the grounds of an error in law, not simply disagreement with the verdict. The Crown argued the trial judge had misdirected the jury on the psychiatric evidence and the burden of proof. On June 5, 1987, the Ontario Court of Appeal ordered a retrial, a decision the Supreme Court of Canada later upheld. Morin's second trial began May 28, 1990, and stretched on for 9 months, making it, at the time, the longest murder trial in Canadian history. This time, the prosecution built its case on 3 pillars: microscopic hair comparison, fiber analysis, and the testimony of jailhouse informants. Forensic analyst Kazimir Niznik testified that a hair on Christine's necklace was microscopically similar to Morin's, and that fibers from his car and home matched fibers on her clothing. What the jury was never properly told is that microscopic hair comparison cannot identify a specific individual, it can only exclude people who clearly don't match. It is not a fingerprint, it's closer to a coin flip dressed up in a lab coat. Worse, the samples had actually been contaminated during handling and storage in shared lab space. a fact that was concealed from both the court and the defense. Then came two jailhouse informants, Robert May and a man identified only as Mr. X, both with documented histories of dishonesty, both hoping to shorten their own sentences. They testified that Morin had confessed to them in custody. There was no independent evidence to back any of it up. It didn't matter. On July 30th, 1992, the jury convicted Guy Paul Morin of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. An innocent man was now a convicted child killer, and the only thing that could undo it was a piece of technology that, just a few years earlier, hadn't existed at all. By the early 1990s, a new technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, testing was emerging, a method that could amplify tiny amounts of degraded genetic material and generate a real individualized DNA profile, something microscopic hair comparison could never do. In January 1995, joint testing by the Center of Forensic Sciences and an independent U.S. laboratory finally produced a conclusive genetic profile from the semen stain on Christine's underwear. It excluded Guy Paul Morin completely. On January 23, 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal set aside his conviction and formally acquitted him. He had spent 18 months in prison and a decade of his life under the crushing weight of prosecution for a crime he did not commit. He received an official apology from the Ontario Attorney General and $1.25 million in compensation. But exoneration wasn't the same thing as answers. The DNA that cleared Morin didn't match anyone in any law enforcement database. Somewhere out there, the actual killer of Christine Jessop was still walking free and had been for over a decade already. The Ontario government commissioned a public inquiry led by retired Justice Fred Kaufman to figure out exactly how this had happened. When the Kaufman report was released on April 9, 1998, it ran 1,380 pages and delivered 119 recommendations. Its conclusion was blunt. Investigators had displayed tunnel vision in the most staggering proportions. The hair and fiber evidence was, in the report's words, essentially valueless. The report called for mandatory recording of interrogations, strict new limits on jailhouse informants, and a complete overhaul of forensic science practices in Ontario. Reforms that quietly reshaped how homicide cases are investigated across Canada to this day. The system had learned its lesson about Guy Paul Morin, but it still had no idea who had actually killed Christine Jessop. And the man responsible had been standing in plain sight the entire time, close enough that police had written his name down and simply never asked him a single question. His name was Calvin Dana Hoover, 28 years old at the time of the murder, a cable installer working for Eastern Independent Telecom in Markham, Ontario, the very company where Bob Jessop worked as the lead hand of the installation crew. Hoover and Bob weren't just co-workers, they were close friends. Their families spent time together at barbecues and birthday parties. Hoover's wife Heather and Janet Jessop had become close confidantes. Christine called her Auntie Heather. The Hoover's kids played with Christine regularly. Hoover's name appears twice in the original cold case files as a close family friend with regular access to the Jessop home, and he was never once formally interviewed. Investigators never checked his workplace logs, never verified where he was on October 3, 1984. His closeness to the family and the fact that he showed up to help search for Christine and later attended her funeral seems to have made him invisible as a suspect. The same social proximity that should have raised questions instead erased them entirely. And there's a detail buried in the file that makes this failure even more painful. In early 1985, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit gave investigators a criminal profile, an intelligent white male, resident of Queensville, aged 19 to 26. Police used that profile to justify their focus on the 25-year-old Morin, but the same profile technically excluded Hoover, a 28-year-old living in Scarborough. The tool meant to narrow the search may have actively steered detectives away from the real killer. So how did Hoover know Christine would be alone that afternoon? 2 days before her murder, on October 1, 1984, Janet Jessop had taken her kids to visit the Hoovers at their home near the Toronto Zoo. During that visit, she mentioned her upcoming trip to see Bob at the detention center and that Christine, being too young, would be staying home and going to school as usual. Whether Hoover heard this directly or was told by his wife afterward, he now had exactly the information he needed. Christine would be alone, and he was someone she trusted enough to walk up to without fear. Investigators believe that on the afternoon of October 3rd, Hoover drove to Queensville and because Christine knew him as a trusted family friend, she likely approached his vehicle willingly, possibly believing he was taking her to see her father. He then drove her 55 kilometers to that remote wooded tract in Sunderland, a location he knew intimately from years of kayaking and camping trips with an old friend who lived nearby. After the murder, he simply went back to his life. When his wife came home and learned Christine was missing, Hoover joined the search parties. He attended the wake. He attended the funeral. He grieved alongside a family he had destroyed. For the next 30 years, Calvin Hoover carried this secret through a slow and visible unraveling, a divorce in 1993, personal bankruptcy in 1991, a drunk driving conviction in 1996, a bipolar disorder diagnosis around 2010, and eventually crippling anxiety and panic attacks. In the summer of 2015, while his son was away at a wedding, Hoover drank a bottle of wine, took tranquilizers, and ran a generator inside an enclosed space. He died of carbon monoxide poisoning. No note, no confession. He took his secret with him, or so it seemed. Because in death, without knowing it, Calvin Hoover had left behind the one thing that would eventually expose him, a routine postmortem blood sample quietly archived at the Center of Forensic Sciences. By 2019, the semen sample recovered from Christine's underwear in 1984 was still sitting in evidence storage, but it was severely degraded, far too damaged for standard forensic DNA testing to squeeze out anything new. Traditional police databases like Canada's National DNA Databank or the FBI's CODIS system in the US only work if the actual perpetrator's DNA is already on file. If Hoover had no prior arrest or conviction, no database search would ever find him. So the Toronto Police Service's Cold Case Unit partnered with Othram Inc., a private forensic genomics laboratory in Houston, Texas. Instead of relying on the roughly 20 genetic markers used in standard STR testing, Othram used what's called forensic-grade genome sequencing, reading hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, across the degraded sample. It's a fundamentally different approach, one built not to match a suspect directly, but to map an entire family tree. That dense genetic profile was handed to forensic genealogist Anthony Redgrave, who uploaded it to commercial ancestry databases like GidMatch and Family Tree DNA, the same kind of platforms ordinary people use to find lost relatives. The search returned more than 24 distant genetic matches, none of them close enough to be the killer himself, but each one a thread leading back toward a shared ancestor. Redgrave's team spent months reconstructing sprawling, multi-generational family trees, tracing distant cousins backward until the branches converged. Eventually, they identified a second cousin once removed who fit the statistical profile precisely. Following that family line forward through the generations, the search narrowed from dozens of possibilities down to exactly one name. On August 7, 2020, Anthony Redgrave submitted that name to the Toronto Police Service, Calvin Dana Hoover. There was just one problem left to solve. Hoover had been dead for 5 years. But investigators discovered that his post-mortem blood sample from 2015 had never been destroyed. It was still archived at the Center of Forensic Sciences. On October 9, 2020, forensic scientists extracted DNA from that sample and ran a direct comparison against the 1984 crime scene semen profile. It was a perfect match. On October 15, 2020, Toronto Police Interim Chief James Raymer stood in front of cameras for a live-stream press conference and said the words that 36 years of investigation had been building toward. He confirmed that DNA testing had positively matched the semen found on Christine Jessup's underwear to Calvin Hoover, and stated plainly, if he were alive today, the Toronto Police Service would arrest Calvin Hoover for the murder of Christine Jessup. But because Hoover had died in 2015, Canadian law does not allow criminal prosecution to continue against a deceased person. There would be no trial, no verdict, no sentencing. The case was legally closed, resolved in fact, but never tested in a courtroom. For Christine's family, that resolution arrived as a strange, complicated mixture of relief and fresh grief. Kenny Jessup, who was 14 when his sister disappeared and had spent decades battling substance abuse in the aftermath, described the revelation as something that came out of the blue. He remembered Heather Hoover well, Auntie Heather, but barely remembered being around Calvin himself, and yet he said, seeing the mugshot, it all fit together. Janet Jessup, who had spent 36 years searching for answers, finally had them, delivered by the revelation that a man her family had trusted, invited into their home, and grieved alongside at their daughter's funeral, had been the one who took her. In a joint family statement, she and Kinney put it starkly: the system had convicted an innocent man of a horrendous crime, and in doing so, had also convicted an entire innocent family to 36 years of pain, hurt, whispers, and nightmares. Janet passed away from COPD shortly before a comprehensive documentary on the case was released, but not before she got her answers, and not before she saw her son finally find stability. Bob Jessop, too, lived long enough to learn his daughter's killer's name before he died. The Christine Jessop case isn't just a story about a monstrous crime. It's a case study in exactly how criminal justice systems fail and, eventually, how they can be forced to fix themselves. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Moran exposed how dangerous it is to build a case around a feeling instead of evidence, how flawed forensic science can be dressed up in false certainty, and how desperate jailhouse informants can be weaponized to fill in the gaps prosecutors can't prove. The Kaufman Report's 119 recommendations reshaped interrogation practices, forensic accountability, and the treatment of informant testimony across Canada. And the eventual identification of Calvin Hoover proves something else entirely: that the technology born from consumer curiosity, ordinary people uploading their DNA just to find long-lost relatives, could one day reach backward through a family tree and pull a killer out of hiding, even 5 years after his death. The same method that found Hoover is the same method that identified the Golden State Killer in the United States in 2018. A reminder that this isn't just a Canadian story. It's the story of a new era in forensic science, one where no cold case and no killer may ever truly be unreachable again. But it also leaves behind an uncomfortable question that investigators, lawmakers, and privacy advocates are still wrestling with. If one distant relative's decision to upload their DNA for a hobby can expose an entire family line to law enforcement scrutiny, where exactly is the line between solving crimes and eroding genetic privacy for people who never asked to be part of any investigation at all? November 30, 2010. A quiet bookstore in South Salt Lake. A husband walks in from running errands, expecting to find his wife behind the counter, like she is every single day. Instead, he finds her body in the back stockroom. The killer left behind his own blood, his fingerprints, a bloody palm print, even a men's designer belt lying right next to her. It was by almost any measure an overwhelming amount of physical evidence, and yet, for 10 years, none of it led anywhere. No name, no face, no arrest, just a case file that grew thicker every year while the man responsible walked free, got married, held down a job, and lived less than a mile from where it happened. What finally cracked this case wasn't a witness or a confession out of nowhere. It was a technology nobody in 2010 even knew existed yet, and the story of how investigators used it is one of the most quietly remarkable cold case breakthroughs in American forensic history. To understand why this case shook South Salt Lake so deeply, you have to understand who Sherry Black actually was, because she was about as far from a random crime victim as you could imagine. Sherry Nielsen was born on October 14, 1946, in Orem, Utah. By 1958, as a young girl, she had already developed a passion for books that would quietly define the rest of her life. She met her husband, Earl Black, at their high school dances, and the two married on April 16, 1965. A year later, their daughter Heidi was born. For 10 years, from 1976 to 1986, Sherry worked as a docent at Salt Lake City's Hogle Zoo, traveling out to elementary schools with live animals to teach kids about conservation. By the time she became a grandmother in 1986, she had already built a reputation as someone who gave her time freely to her community. Professionally, Sherry and Earl ran B&W Billiards and Books together, a shop at 346 South 700 East in South Salt Lake, built right next to their own house. Earl handled the billiards side, restoring pool tables in the workshop. Sherry ran the books, rare, used, out-of-print, collectible. She knew the inventory so well, she never bothered writing it down. No computer system, no ledger, it all lived in her head. By 2010, she was 64 years old, a grandmother of 6, and through her daughter Heidi's marriage to Greg Miller, former CEO of the Larry H. Miller Group in the Utah Jazz, connected to some of the most recognizable names in Utah business. But she never lived like it. She stayed behind the counter of her own small bookstore, tracking down obscure titles for collectors who wandered in off the street. Investigators would later confirm something important. Sherry Black had no known enemies, no disputes, no documented conflicts with anyone. She wasn't targeted because of who she was, and that single fact that this was a stranger, not someone from her life, is exactly what would make this case so difficult to crack. Because when police have no relationship to trace, no motive to chase, no grudge to investigate, where do you even start? Tuesday, November 30th, 2010. Sherry Black was alone in the store, just like most days. Earl was out running errands. At approximately 1:43 p.m., Earl returned to the property and walked into the shop. When he searched the building, he found his wife unresponsive on the floor of the rear stockroom. He called emergency services immediately. First responders arrived to find severe trauma. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy conducted the following day by the Utah Office of the Medical Examiner told a brutal story. Sherry Black had been stabbed 9 times with a pair of heavy-duty tailor shears found at the scene. She'd also suffered blunt force injuries consistent with a severe beating to her head, neck, and torso. Years later, District Attorney Sim Gill would confirm one more disturbing detail that hadn't been public at the time. The evidence showed she had also been assaulted after her death. Here's what made the crime scene so strange, though. The violence was concentrated almost entirely in that narrow rear stockroom out front. The customer counter and retail floor were untouched. Nothing looked ransacked. Nothing looked staged like a robbery gone wrong. And because Sherry kept the entire inventory in her memory rather than on paper, investigators couldn't even determine whether anything specific had actually been stolen. There was no ledger to compare against empty shelves. If a rare book was missing, there was no way to know. But whoever did this left something behind that no criminal wants to leave at a murder scene themselves. Pooled and smeared near the body was blood that didn't belong to Sherry Black, a man's blood, suggesting the attacker had cut his own hand during the struggle. Investigators lifted latent fingerprints from nearby surfaces along with a distinct bloody palm print. And lying beside her body was a men's Armani exchange belt, AX buckle, size 36 to 38 inches, with a small sticker on the back of the buckle bearing the handwritten digits 323. On paper, this should have been an easy case. DNA, fingerprints, a palm print, a traceable clothing item. Investigators had more physical evidence than most cold cases ever dream of, so why did it take 10 years to get a name? The South Salt Lake Police Department took the lead with Captain Jack Carruth, Sergeant Gary Keller, and Lieutenant Dwayne Ruth overseeing the scene. Officers secured the building, canvassed the neighborhood, and pulled search warrants to comb through the shop, the workshop, and the surrounding property. Earl Black and the rest of the family cooperated fully, submitted to elimination interviews, and were quickly cleared. This wasn't a domestic case. This was someone from outside the family, outside Sherry's world entirely. In December 2010, police went public with photos of the Armani exchange belt, hoping the odd 323 sticker might jog someone's memory. A thrift store clerk, a pawnshop worker, anyone who might recognize where that tag came from. The Black and Miller families put up a $50,000 reward for information. Detectives had already executed search warrants on the retail space, the workshop, and the surrounding grounds, methodically recovering every trace of physical evidence they could find. Then, in February 2011, the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services extracted a clean, full male DNA profile from the blood at the scene. This was the moment that should have solved everything. The profile went straight into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, the same system that has cracked thousands of cases by matching crime scene evidence against the DNA of known offenders. It came back with nothing. No match. In May 2011, the sample was sent to Sorensen Forensics for deeper analysis. What came back was intriguing but limited. The perpetrator's DNA showed 59% West Sub-Saharan African biogeographical ancestry. It was a clue about who he might be, but it wasn't a name, and in 2011 there was no scientific pathway yet to turn ancestry percentages into an actual identity. Detectives interviewed dozens of people. They chased hundreds of tips. They collected voluntary DNA samples from persons of interest. None of it connected. And underneath all of it sat one detail nobody in the department knew yet, a detail that would later explain the entire 10-year delay, and it had nothing to do with detective work at all. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely frustrate you, because the reason this case sat unsolved for a decade wasn't bad police work. It was a gap in the law itself. 6 weeks before Sherry Black's murder, on September 16, 2010, a 19-year-old named Adam Antonio Spencer Durborough was arrested for shoplifting in West Valley City. He pleaded guilty on October 27, 2010, and received probation along with a suspended 60-day jail sentence. Under Utah law at the time, DNA collection was mandatory for felony convictions and Class A misdemeanors. Durborough's shoplifting charge was a Class B misdemeanor, a category that fell just below the legal threshold requiring a DNA sample. So even though his blood was sitting in an evidence locker in South Salt Lake, and even though he'd been arrested just 6 weeks before the murder, his genetic profile was never entered into CODIS. There was nothing for the system to match against. Then, on January 15, 2011, 6 weeks after the murder, Durborough was arrested again, this time for theft. He pleaded guilty on February 1st, sentenced to 180 days in jail. But he was released early due to jail overcrowding, and again no DNA collection followed. Twice, this man was in police custody within weeks of the murder. Twice, the system had a legal chance to capture his DNA. Twice, it didn't happen because of a statutory line drawn between misdemeanor classes. Add to that the absence of any personal connection between Sherry Black and her killer, no relationship, no grudge, nothing for detectives to trace through phone records or financial statements, and you start to see the full picture. This wasn't a case that was solvable through traditional detective work, interviews, canvases, financial digging. None of it works when the killer is a total stranger who's never crossed paths with the victim before. There was a third obstacle working against detectives too, one that had nothing to do with DNA at all. Because Sherry kept her entire book inventory in her memory instead of on paper, there was no way to generate a list of what, if anything, might have gone missing from the shop. That closed off an entire avenue of investigation, tracking stolen merchandise through pawn shops, online auctions, or antique dealers simply wasn't possible when nobody could say for certain what, if anything, had been taken. Even the Armani exchange belt, the single most publicized piece of evidence in the case, hit a dead end of its own. The 323 sticker on the buckle never traced back to a specific retail transaction or point of sale. It was a distinctive object with no paper trail attached to it, visible, photographed, publicized for years, and still functionally silent. The case went formally cold in 2013. The Unified Police Department's Cold Case Unit joined the investigation alongside South Salt Lake Police. But for years, the file sat there, full of evidence, empty of answers. What it needed wasn't more manpower, it needed technology that simply didn't exist yet. Between 2011 and 2017, the case moved forward in small, almost experimental steps, each one a piece of a puzzle nobody could fully assemble yet. In February 2012, the Vidocq Society, a group of forensic experts known for tackling stubborn cold cases, spent a week reviewing the file, producing behavioral profiles, and recommending detectives revisit the biological evidence using newer testing methods. They came back for a second review in May 2015, this time pushing for probabilistic genotyping and next-generation sequencing, both relatively new forensic techniques at the time. Then came November 30th, 2017, the 7th anniversary of Sherry Black's murder. On that date, police unveiled something the public had never seen in this case before: composite images generated by Parabon nanolabs using a system called Snapshot built on DNA phenotyping. Here's what that actually means. Scientists can now analyze single nucleotide polymorphisms, tiny variations in DNA, to predict physical traits with real statistical confidence. In this case, the analysis produced a 97.8% probability of light brown skin, a 99.6% probability of black hair, and a 55.2% probability of brown or black eyes, From there, Parabon generated composite sketches showing what their suspect might look like at 3 different ages: 25, 38, and 52. It was an unsettling thing to watch unfold publicly. An unknown man's face, reconstructed entirely from blood left at a murder scene 7 years earlier. But a composite sketch still isn't a name, it's a description, not an identity. The real turning point was still coming, and it would arrive through a tool most people had never even heard of. In 2018, the case was formally reassigned to Unified Police Department cold case detective Ben Pender, who took over as lead investigator. Pender partnered with Parabon Nanolabs to pursue something called investigative genetic genealogy, IgG for short. The concept behind IgG is different from a standard CODIS search. Instead of looking for a direct match to a known criminal offender, investigators upload a crime scene DNA profile to public genealogy databases, the same kind of databases people use to build family trees or find long-lost relatives. Even if the actual suspect has never submitted their own DNA anywhere, a distant cousin, aunt, or grandparent might have. From there, genealogists work backward, building out family trees until the branches converge on a single living person who fits the age, location, and biological profile of the suspect. On September 18, 2020, that's exactly what happened. The S&P profile from the Sherry Black crime scene, uploaded to GIDmatch, returned matches to distant relatives. None of those matches were close enough to be a parent or a sibling. They were the kind of distant, third or fourth cousin matches that, on their own, mean almost nothing. But genetic genealogy isn't about finding one perfect match. It's about slowly building outward from dozens of small imperfect ones until multiple branches of a family tree start pointing toward the same intersection. Detective Pender began tracing exactly that branch by branch, and it eventually led him to a single man in California. Pender flew out, obtained a reference DNA swab directly from this man, and confirmed something enormous: paternity. This was the biological father of the person investigators had been hunting for a decade, and the father gave Pender something that no amount of forensic science alone could have provided: human memory. He shared the name of the child's biological mother, a photograph of the child at 3 months old, and the name given to the baby at birth: Antonio. 10 years of silence, and suddenly, for the first time, investigators had a first name. But a first name from a birth record decades old still isn't an arrest. Somewhere between that infant photograph and the present day, Antonio had grown into a completely different identity, one that would take one more piece of old-fashioned records work to finally uncover. In early October 2020, detectives cross-referenced the biological mother's family line with public records, and an obituary for the child's maternal grandmother became the piece that closed the loop. It connected the birth name Antonio to the man now living under a different name entirely: Adam Antonio Spencer Durbarow. Durbarow was 19 years old at the time of the murder and 29 at the time of his identification. He was living and working in Orem, Utah. And here's where the case takes on a chilling layer of proximity that nobody had uncovered in 10 years of investigation. In November 2010, Durbarow's biological mother lived within 1 mile of B&W Billiards and Books. His adoptive father, Joseph Durbarow, ran a commercial photography business called Joseph Paul Photography and had previously lived on the corner of 500 East and Penny Avenue in South Salt Lake, literally around the corner from Sherry Black's home. This wasn't a stranger who wandered in from across the city. This was someone with roots planted just steps away from the crime scene the entire time. There's another detail buried in the record that deserves its own moment, because it's genuinely disturbing in hindsight. Joseph Durbarow, the adoptive father, was arrested in 2002 as part of a federal investigation called Operation Hamlet and convicted of producing and distributing child exploitation material, serving 10 years in federal prison. And then there's this. On November 30th, 2012, exactly 2 years to the day after he murdered Sherry Black, Adam Durbarow posted an image on social media. It showed a cartoon character holding a blood-stained saw captioned, "Don't upset me, I'm running out of places to hide the bodies," for 8 more years. That post sat online. Nobody connected it to anything. Nobody was looking at him at all. Now, in October 2020, investigators finally had a name, a face, and an address. The only thing left to do was confirm it and make sure he couldn't run. On October 7, 2020, detectives began surveilling Durborough directly. In public, they surreptitiously collected an item containing his discarded biological material, the kind of abandoned DNA sampling that doesn't require a warrant, because once something is thrown away, it's no longer legally private. That sample went straight to the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services for expedited testing. On October 8th, the results came back. A match to the male blood recovered from the stockroom floor a decade earlier. Fingerprint and palm print comparisons quickly confirmed the same thing. Every major piece of physical evidence from November 30th, 2010 now pointed to one specific, living, breathing person. On the morning of Saturday, October 10, 2020, officers from the Unified Police Department and South Salt Lake Police Department conducted a traffic stop near Durborough's Orem home as he was on his way to work. He was taken into custody without incident. At the station, after being read his Miranda rights, Durborough waived his right to an attorney and gave a full confession detailing his role in Sherry Black's murder. He was booked into Salt Lake County Jail on felony charges of aggravated murder and aggravated burglary. 10 years, 10 months, and 10 days after Sherry Black's body was found, the man responsible was finally in handcuffs, but an arrest and a confession still had to survive the courtroom. On October 26, 2020, Salt Lake County District Attorney Sim Gill formally filed first-degree felony charges of aggravated murder and aggravated burglary against Durborough. Nearly a year later, on October 4, 2021, Durborough appeared before 3rd District Judge Randall Scanchi and entered a guilty plea to aggravated murder. D.A. Gill was clear with the public that no deals or sentencing concessions had been offered in exchange for that plea. This wasn't a negotiated reduction. It was a full admission. On February 23, 2022, Judge Scanchi sentenced Adam Durborough to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at the Utah State Prison. Afterward, D.A. Sim Gill spoke to reporters and put the entire 12-year journey into a single sentence. Today, a measure of justice was found. It is imperfect, but the best our system can do. It wasn't a triumphant statement. It was an honest one, an acknowledgement that no sentence, however severe, could actually undo what happened inside that stockroom in 2010. It could only close the file. The guilty plea also meant something else. It spared the Black family from having to sit through a public trial where the most painful details of the crime, including the post-mortem assault, would have been discussed in open court. Throughout the court proceedings, members of the Black and Miller families were present at every hearing, and by the time sentencing arrived, they publicly stood behind the life without peril outcome as the right resolution for a case that had taken a decade to even reach a courtroom. No appeals or petitions for post-conviction relief have been filed since. Legally, the case was finished. But for the people closest to Sherry Black, closing the case file was never going to be the same thing as closing the chapter entirely. While detectives worked the case behind closed doors, South Salt Lake experienced this murder very publicly, and for years, the community response never really faded. In the initial years after 2010, the neighborhood held annual candlelight vigils in Sherry Black's memory. Regional outlets like KSL-TV, Deseret News, and the Salt Lake Tribune covered the case extensively from the very beginning, and their early reporting centered almost entirely on that one strange piece of physical evidence, the Armani exchange belt. That belt became something of an obsession for amateur investigators. Online crime forums spent years picking apart the 323 sticker on the back of the buckle, debating whether it was a thrift store price tag, some kind of inventory code, or a marker tied to a specific retail location. It's a strange thing to watch happen in real time, a piece of clothing turning into the internet's best guess at solving a murder. Years before anyone had heard the name Adam Durborough, interest surged again in 2017, when police released the Parabon phenotyping composites on the 7th anniversary of the murder. Suddenly, there was a face, or at least a scientifically generated approximation of one, and local news coverage spiked right alongside it. Then, after the 2020 arrest and the 2022 guilty plea, the story went national. True crime broadcasts, forensic trade publications like Forensic Magazine, and podcasts including The Deck produced deep retrospectives on the case, using it as a case study in exactly how far DNA science had come in a single decade. And once the details of the investigation became public, so did a specific kind of frustration. People wanted to know how a man with 2 separate arrests within weeks of the murder had managed to stay completely off the radar for 10 years. The answer, as you now know, traced back to a single administrative line in Utah's DNA collection statute. That frustration didn't just fade away. It turned into something the family was already positioned to act on. For Sherry Black's family, justice wasn't the end of the story. It became the beginning of a new mission entirely. Heidi Miller, Sherry's daughter, had actually been fighting for stronger DNA collection laws since long before her mother's killer was identified. Back in 2014, she advocated at the Utah Capitol for the passage of HB 212, legislation aimed at expanding when law enforcement could collect DNA samples. Then, after her mother's case was finally solved using genetic genealogy, she pushed further. On March 3, 2023, the Utah legislature passed what's now known as the Sherry Black Bill, establishing formal state regulations governing how law enforcement can use genetic genealogy in investigations, a direct legislative legacy of the exact technology that cracked her mother's case. The family also founded the Sherry Black Foundation, which funds cold case training symposiums for law enforcement across Utah, giving investigators access to the same advanced DNA methodologies that finally identified Durborough. Law enforcement recognized the work too. On March 21, 2020, 2/13/22, the U.S. Department of Justice awarded Detective Ben Pender the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service in Policing, honoring the investigative genetic genealogy work that had spent years quietly, methodically chasing down a name that started as nothing more than a percentage on an ancestry report. Salt Lake County Sheriff Rosie Rivera later pointed to the case as proof that cold files are never truly closed, only waiting for the right combination of science and persistence, and she specifically credited the collaboration between the Unified Police Department, South Salt Lake Police, the District Attorney's Office, and Parabon Nanolabs as the reason the case finally moved. SSLPD Chief Jack Carruth, who had responded to the scene himself back in 2010 as a captain, spoke about the years of frustration his department carried, watching detective after detective inherit a file full of evidence and no name to attach it to, long before genetic genealogy finally gave them an answer. Zoom out from this one case, and the numbers get even more staggering. Data analyzed by the Murder Accountability Project shows that roughly 340,000 homicides in the United States remained unsolved between 1965 and 2021. A huge number of those cases share the exact same obstacle that kept Sherry Black's file frozen for a decade, an offender whose DNA simply was never in the system because they'd never been convicted of anything that legally required a sample. Investigative genetic genealogy, the same tool that identified Adam Durborough, has only existed in meaningful use since around 2018. It doesn't need the killer's DNA to already be on file. It only needs a distant relative's, and that single shift has started to change what unsolvable even means for cases like this one. Within Utah specifically, the Sherry Black case is now treated as a regional blueprint, a working example of how combining genetic genealogy with old-fashioned surveillance and abandoned DNA collection can resolve exactly the kind of stranger-on-stranger homicide that traditional detective work was never built to handle. It's the reason the case still gets referenced in forensic training circles years after Durborough's sentencing, long after most true crime coverage has moved on to the next headline. Sherry Black spent her life surrounded by books she knew by heart in a shop she ran without ever needing to write anything down. Her death, for 10 years, was defined by the opposite of that, a case with plenty of evidence and absolutely no way to read it. What finally broke it wasn't a lucky tip or a deathbed confession. It was a decade of forensic science slowly catching up to a crime scene that had been waiting patiently the entire time. A blood sample, a percentage of ancestry, a composite sketch, a distant cousin on a genealogy website, a father in California who still remembered a name he gave his son decades earlier. 10 years is a long time to wait for justice. long enough for a suspended shoplifting sentence to be forgotten, long enough for a 2-year anniversary joke to disappear into a scroll of old social media posts, long enough for a man to build an entire ordinary life a few miles from where he left his own blood on a stockroom floor. But for Sherry Black's family, justice eventually came, and in the process, it changed how cold cases get solved across the entire state of Utah, and arguably across the country. A 10-year-old blood sample sitting quietly in an evidence locker turned out to be more patient than the man who left it there. If this case showed you anything, it's that the real breakthrough here wasn't detective work in the traditional sense. It was genetic genealogy itself, the same method now being used to crack decades-old cold cases all over the U.S. If you want to understand exactly how investigators build a family tree out of nothing but a blood sample, and how that same method has already unmasked killers hiding in plain sight for 30, 40, even 50 years, that's exactly what we break down next. Click the video on your screen and go inside the science that's rewriting what cold case even means. It's 5 in the morning on December 22nd, 1994. The sky over Chickamauga, Georgia is still black. Inside a quiet house on Boss Road, a 54-year-old man named James Richard Harris is doing what he does every single working day of his life. He's getting ready for his shift at Miller Industries, just across the state line in Tennessee. He lives alone. He has a routine. He is, by every account, a steady, law-abiding man who has never given anyone a reason to hurt him. He walks down his own driveway toward the gate, the same gate he opens every morning before sunrise. He never makes it to work that day. By 9 o'clock that morning, a neighbor walking past the property finds him lying motionless at his own entrance gate. He has been struck in the back of the head. He has been strangled, and someone has taken what little he had on him. There are no witnesses. There is no getaway car anyone can describe. There is, for nearly 3 decades, no name. But there is one thing the killer leaves behind without realizing it: a single bloody tissue on the ground beside the body. And that tissue is going to outlive every excuse, every alibi, and every year that passes. It is going to wait patiently in an evidence locker for science to catch up to it. This is the story of how a man who worked beside James Harris, who clocked into the same factory, who knew his schedule better than almost anyone alive, got away with murder for 26 years, until a discarded piece of tissue paper finally spoke his name. To understand why this murder confounded investigators for so long, you first have to understand how ordinary James Harris's life was. He wasn't a man tangled up in disputes. He wasn't involved in anything that police records describe as high risk or dangerous. He lived by himself at 1610 Boss Road, a semi-rural property in Walker County, Georgia, and he held down a job as a production worker at Miller Industries, a manufacturing plant located across the state line in Ooltewah, near Chattanooga, Tennessee. That commute meant something. Every single morning, Harris had to leave his house before daylight to make it to his shift on time. It was a routine so fixed, so predictable, that anyone who worked alongside him would have known almost exactly when he left, which gate he used, and which road he took to get there. He had children, including a son, James Richard Harris Jr., and a wider family, who would spend the next 28 holiday seasons waiting for answers that never came in time for most of them. On the morning of December 22, 1994, Harris followed that same routine one final time. Investigators would later reconstruct that somewhere between 5 and 7 in the morning. As he moved down his driveway to open the gate and begin his commute, someone was waiting for him. What happened next was not a burglary gone wrong inside an empty house, and it was not a random act of road rage. It was an ambush executed at the exact choke point of his property where he was most predictable and most exposed, his own gate. The attacker struck Harris in the back of the head. Then came strangulation, applied with enough force to leave significant soft tissue trauma around his neck. Personal items were taken from him during the assault, which told investigators almost immediately that robbery was the underlying motive. Blood pooled across the ground and the surrounding structures near the gate, physical proof that this had not been quick or clean. There had been a struggle. At approximately 9 o'clock that morning, a neighbor discovered his body. Walker County Sheriff's deputies arrived, recognized instantly that this was a homicide, and made a call that would define the entire next phase of this case. They requested help from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Region 1 field office out of Calhoun. And here's where the story should have ended quickly. Investigators had a body, they had a crime scene. They had physical evidence, including Harris's blood-stained jeans and, critically, a bloody tissue found near where he fell, evidence that suggested his killer had bled during the fight. But knowing that the killer left a piece of himself behind is very different from knowing who he was. And in December 1994, the technology needed to turn a blood stain into a name simply did not exist yet. This is the part of the story that explains everything that follows. Because the reason this case went cold isn't a story of incompetence, it's a story of timing. In 1994, DNA forensics were still in their infancy compared to what exists today. The standard method available to crime labs was RFLP analysis, a technique that required large, well-preserved biological samples to work reliably. The blood stains recovered from Harris's jeans and from that tissue at the scene were exactly the kind of degraded, mixed, small sample evidence that 1994 serology simply could not resolve into a clean, individual profile. Investigators knew, chemically, that a stranger's blood was sitting right there in their evidence room. They had no way yet to turn that blood into a face. Then there was the problem of witnesses or the total absence of them. Voss Road was rural. The attack happened before daybreak at a private gate on a stretch of road with no natural foot traffic to speak of. Nobody saw a vehicle. Nobody saw a person. The isolation that made Harris's property peaceful every other morning of the year is what made it the perfect place to kill him without anyone noticing. But the deepest structural failure in this case was jurisdictional. Harris lived in Walker County, Georgia. He worked in Hamilton County, Tennessee. In 1994, before the kind of digital record sharing and cross-state task force cooperation that exists today, that state line functioned almost like a wall. Investigators canvassed Chickamauga. They interviewed neighbors along Voss Road. What they did not do, what nobody thought to do in those first critical weeks, was conduct a full audit of every single person Harris worked alongside at Miller Industries in Tennessee. That single gap in the investigation meant that a coworker of Harris's, a man who would have known his schedule intimately, was never once interviewed in the original 1994 investigation. By 1995 and into 1996, every local lead had been exhausted. Neighbor interviews had gone nowhere. The physical evidence sat there, biologically rich but scientifically unreadable, with the tools of the time. The Walker County Sheriff's Office and the GBI had no choice but to move the file into cold case storage. For the Harris family, this meant something devastating and simple. The man who killed their father was still out there, possibly still working, possibly still living less than an hour from where they buried him, and nobody could touch him. What almost nobody in Walker County knew at the time was that the answer to this case wasn't going to come from a new witness stepping forward, or a deathbed confession, or a lucky break in an interrogation room. It was going to come more than a decade later from a laboratory technology that hadn't even been invented yet, one that would let scientists read a single, unmistakable identity out of a bloodstain the size of a fingerprint. Cold cases don't stay cold because investigators stop caring. They stay cold because, at some point, every available lead runs out and all that's left to do is wait for the science to evolve enough to ask the evidence new questions. That's exactly what happened here. In 2005, more than a decade after the murder, the GBI's Region 1 field office conducted a systematic review of unsolved cold cases from Walker County. As part of that review, the original bloodstained jeans that Harris had been wearing, along with the bloody tissue recovered from the scene, were resubmitted to the GBI Crime Lab, this time for testing using short tandem repeat, or STR, DNA technology, a far more sensitive and precise method than what had existed in 1994. The results were exactly what investigators had suspected for 11 years, but had never been able to prove. Analysts successfully isolated a single-source male DNA profile from both the genes and the tissue. This wasn't the victim's blood, this was the killer's blood left behind during the physical struggle at the gate, preserved almost perfectly for over a decade inside an evidence locker. For the first time, investigators had a genetic fingerprint belonging to the man who murdered James Harris. But a DNA profile is only useful if you have something to compare it to. Investigators ran the profile against regional databases and checked it against reference samples that had been voluntarily collected from early persons of interest back in the mid-1990s. Every single comparison came back negative. So now the case had reached a strange, almost cruel new plateau. Investigators possessed, with scientific certainty, the exact genetic identity of a murderer. What they did not possess was his name. The bloodstain had finally started talking. It just hadn't said who it belonged to yet. And the answer to that question wasn't going to come from another laboratory breakthrough. It was going to come from something far more old-fashioned, a phone call to a tip line. 4 years after the DNA profile was isolated in 2009, the case took its next turn, and it came from the community itself. A tip was called in to Crime Stoppers. The caller didn't provide a full name, an address, or hard evidence. They gave investigators a single first name to work with, Alan. It's a small, almost frustratingly vague piece of information on its own, but for investigators who had spent years knowing there was a genetic profile sitting unmatched in their files, even a fragment like this was worth chasing seriously. Detectives from the Walker County Sheriff's Office and the GBI went back to the one piece of the original 1994 investigation that had never been fully explored, Harris's workplace. They contacted Miller Industries in Ooltewah, Tennessee, and requested access to historical personnel records from December 1994. Investigators began cross-referencing employee names against the tip, looking specifically for anyone who matched the name Allen. That search led them to Robert Allen Mowry. Mowry had worked at Miller Industries at the exact same time as Harris. He had never been interviewed in the original 1994 investigation, a direct consequence of the jurisdictional gap that had let cross-border employees slip through the cracks 15 years earlier. But when investigators pulled his time card records from the morning of December 22, 1994, they found something that made him impossible to ignore. Mowry had arrived late for his shift that morning, unexcused, uncharacteristically, and the timing lined up almost precisely with the estimated window of the murder just miles away on the other side of the state line. For the first time in 15 years, investigators had a name attached to a timeline that fit. They had motive potential through his employment connection to Harris. They had a DNA profile sitting in a lab file waiting for a match. Every piece except one was now in place. They did not have his DNA. This is in some ways the most agonizing chapter of the entire investigation, not because nothing was happening, but because investigators now knew almost certainly who they were looking at and still could not act. Identifying Robert Allen Mowry as the primary investigative target in 2009 was not the same thing as having enough legal grounds to compel him to give a DNA sample. A late time card and a partial tip line name, no matter how compelling to detectives, did not rise to the level of probable cause required for a search warrant. Without a direct comparison sample from Mowry, there was no legal way to confirm the match to the 2005 crime scene profile, and without that confirmation, there was no way to arrest him. So the case entered a strange holding pattern. Mowry was, by all appearances, living a completely normal life. Records show he resided in Tennessee, in locations including Tullahoma and later Nashville. He was not on the run. He was not hiding in any obvious sense. He simply existed year after year, on the other side of a legal threshold that investigators could see but not yet cross. Between 2009 and 2020, investigators maintained what can only be described as patient, low-profile intelligence work, watching, waiting, and looking for the moment when they could legally close the gap between we believe it's him and we can prove it's him. That moment would not come from a confession, a slip-up, or a new witness. It would come from a coordinated operation involving 7 separate law enforcement agencies, executed with the singular goal of obtaining something Mowry would leave behind without ever realizing it, just like he had at the crime scene 26 years earlier. In 2020, the case that had quietly outlived one generation of investigators became the focus of a full multi-agency task force. This wasn't a single detective working a hunch anymore. It was the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Walker County Sheriff's Office, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the Tullahoma Police Department, the Coffee County Sheriff's Office, and the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department, all coordinating across 2 states with one shared objective. The plan was straightforward in concept and painstaking in execution. Conduct physical surveillance on Robert Allen Mowry in Tennessee and recover a biological sample from him without his knowledge, something he discarded, something ordinary, something that would carry his DNA without requiring his consent or his awareness that he was being watched. The operation succeeded. Investigators secured a surreptitious sample and submitted it directly to the GBI crime lab for comparison against the male DNA profile that had been sitting in storage since 2005. The profile pulled from Harris's bloodstained genes and that single bloody tissue found beside his body in 1994. The result was a direct confirmed nuclear DNA match. 26 years after Robert Allen Mowry left a piece of himself behind at a rural Georgia gate, that same genetic evidence identified him with scientific certainty. On September 4, 2020 at 10 o'clock at night, special agents with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation arrested Robert Allen Mowry in Nashville. He was 50 years old. He had been 24 at the time of the murder, a young co-worker with intimate knowledge of Harris's schedule who had simply gone home, kept working, and built an entire adult life in the decades that followed, all while the tissue paper he dropped at a crime scene sat waiting in an evidence room for technology to catch up. The arrest closed one chapter, but for the Harris family and for the state of Georgia, there was still one more step required before this could truly be called justice. A jury had to hear the evidence and decide. Robert Allen Mowry was formally indicted in Walker County Superior Court under case number 22CR025 within the Lookout Mountain Judicial Circuit. The grand jury charged him with 4 felony counts, malice murder, felony murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Pre-trial proceedings, including calendar calls and motions, played out through November of 2022, more than 2 years after his arrest. The case finally reached trial in late November of 2023, and over the course of 7 trial days, prosecutors Deanna Reisman and Alan Smith laid out for the jury a case built almost entirely on physical science and paper records. They called forensic scientists from the GBI crime lab to walk the jury through exactly how the STR DNA match had been made. They called former co-workers from Miller Industries. They called neighbors from Boss Road who remembered the morning the body was found. And they called law enforcement officers from both Georgia and Tennessee to explain how a name whispered into a tip line in 2009 had finally, in 2020, connected to an irrefutable genetic match. The defense, represented by attorney Martin J. Levitt, maintained a plea of not guilty throughout the proceedings. But against a single source male DNA profile that had been isolated from the victim's own clothing and matched directly to Mowry's covertly collected sample, there was very little room to argue coincidence. On Wednesday, December 6, 2023, the Walker County jury returned its verdict, guilty of felony murder. The presiding judge did not delay. Mowry was sentenced immediately to life imprisonment in the custody of the Georgia Department of Corrections. 29 years after James Harris walked down his own driveway for the last time, the case bearing his name was finally closed. The resolution of the Harris case is not an isolated story. It fits into a much larger and frankly staggering national pattern. According to statistics compiled by the Murder Accountability Project using FBI uniform crime reporting data, roughly 340,000 homicide and non-negligent manslaughter cases went unsolved in the United States between 1965 and 2021. 340,000. Each one, like the Harris case, likely has its own version of a bloody tissue sitting in an evidence locker somewhere, waiting for forensic science to catch up. What makes the Harris case such a clear example of how these cold cases actually get solved is what it was not. It was not solved through investigative genetic genealogy or a GED match, family tree search techniques that have become famous in other high-profile cold case breakthroughs in recent years. This case was solved the more traditional way: a preserved biological sample, a direct STR comparison, a tip line name, and a workplace time card that placed a coworker at the wrong place at the wrong time. It's a case study in why physical evidence preservation matters as much as the science that eventually reads it. For the Walker County community, the case became a validation of exactly that principle, that cold cases are not truly closed, only paused, and that the GBI's Region 1 field office and the Lookout Mountain Judicial Circuit's persistence over nearly 3 decades is what ultimately gave the Harris family their resolution that 28 holidays without answers had denied them. James Richard Harris left his house before sunrise on December 22, 1994, expecting nothing more unusual than another ordinary shift at the factory where he'd worked for years. Instead, he became the center of one of Northwest Georgia's longest-running unsolved homicides, a case that outlasted the technology that eventually solved it, outlasted a 15-year silence after a single tip line word, and outlasted 11 more years after investigators already knew a suspect's name but couldn't yet prove it. What finally closed the case wasn't luck. It was patience, the patience of a crime lab that kept revisiting old evidence with new technology, the patience of investigators who couldn't act on a name for over a decade, and the patience of a family who waited 29 years to hear the word guilty spoken in a Walker County courtroom. Robert Allen Mowry is now serving a life sentence for a murder he likely believed for over 2 decades he had gotten away with. He was wrong, and the single piece of evidence that proved it was something he probably never even remembered dropping. If this kind of case fascinates you, a killer who hid in plain sight for decades until one overlooked piece of evidence brought the whole thing down, I've covered another cold case where investigators sat on a suspect's identity for years before the science finally caught up to make the arrest possible. Go watch that one next, because the pattern you just saw play out here shows up again and again in how America's oldest unsolved murders finally get solved. On the morning of August 22, 1996, a father drove to his daughter's apartment because she hadn't shown up for a trip they'd planned together. He knocked. No answer. He let himself in, and on the floor of that second-floor apartment in Northeast Fresno, he found her. What he saw that morning would launch one of the most agonizing unsolved cases in Central California history, a case that would take 29 years, one wrongful arrest, a serial predator hiding in plain sight, and a piece of technology that didn't even exist yet to finally close. This is the story of how Debbie Dorian's killer was found, not through a lucky break, but through science that hadn't been invented when she died. Deborah Dorian was 22 years old. She was a student at California State University, Fresno, living in a second-floor apartment near Cedar and Teague Avenues, in a quiet stretch of northeast Fresno. People who knew her described her the way people described someone they genuinely admired: industrious, bright, responsible, the kind of young woman with her future already taking shape in front of her. On August 22, 1996, that future had a plan attached to it. Debbie was supposed to travel to San Francisco with her father, Peter Dorian. The arrangement was simple. She'd stop by his place first, then they'd head out together. It was the kind of ordinary family logistics that happens in a million households every single day, except she never showed up. Peter waited, then he worried, then he did what any parent would do. He drove to her apartment to check on her. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, and when he entered, he found his daughter dead on the floor of her own home. What investigators uncovered next made clear this wasn't a random act of chance violence. It was calculated, prolonged, and brutal. Debbie had been bound with heavy-duty duct tape wrapped tightly around her mouth, her nose, her wrists, and her ankles. The tape wasn't just used to restrain her, it became the instrument of her death. The medical examiner would later confirm the cause: asphyxiation, caused directly by that tape cutting off her airway. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, and the physical evidence confirmed she had been forcibly raped and sodomized before she died. There was, however, one piece of the crime scene that offered a sliver of hope for justice. Investigators recovered a high-quality foreign DNA profile from Debbie's body, genetic material left behind by her attacker. In 1996, DNA science was still young, still evolving, and still limited in what it could definitively prove. But that sample would end up being preserved, entered into state databases, and would eventually become the single thread that connected everything that followed. At the time, though, nobody knew any of that. All the Fresno Police Department knew was that a young woman was dead, a killer was loose, and the community wanted answers immediately. That pressure would lead investigators to their first suspect and their first mistake. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, detectives moved fast. Within days, in late August of 1996, they arrested a local man named Maurice Dixon, someone connected to the area around Debbie's apartment complex. The arrest was based on a preliminary DNA test, one of the early-generation forensic techniques available at the time, which investigators believed linked Dixon to the biological evidence recovered from the scene. For 2 weeks, Dixon sat in custody as the presumed killer of Debbie Dorian, but DNA science in the mid-1990s was in the middle of a rapid transformation. The tools available in a police lab in 1996 could look completely different and vastly more accurate just months later. In September of 1996, a more advanced high-resolution DNA analysis was performed on the same crime scene samples. And this time, the results were unambiguous. Maurice Dixon's DNA did not match the killer's. He was released, exonerated, sent back into his life carrying the weight of having been publicly accused of a murder he didn't commit. For the Fresno Police Department, this left them exactly where they'd started, except worse. They no longer had a suspect, they'd already used up their public credibility on one, and the actual killer was still out there walking free, with no name and no face attached to him. Most cold cases die in moments like this one. The public attention fades. The leads dry up. The file gets pushed to the back of a drawer, but two detectives on this case refuse to let that happen. Robert Chiotis and Vince Zavala, the primary homicide investigators assigned to Debbie's murder, made a personal commitment to her family that they would not give up, and they didn't. Even after both men eventually retired from the Fresno Police Department, they kept coming back to this file. Voluntarily on their own time reviewing evidence, chasing leads, refusing to let Debbie Dorian become just another number in a filing cabinet. Their persistence would matter enormously, but persistence alone doesn't solve a case when the technology to solve it doesn't exist yet. For that, this story needed the people who loved Debbie most to keep her name alive long enough for the science to catch up. For over 2 decades, the murder of Debbie Dorian remained officially unsolved, but it was never forgotten because her parents wouldn't allow it to be. In March of 1997, just 7 months after her death, Peter Dorian launched a public campaign on his own initiative. He printed reward flyers himself and distributed them throughout Fresno and the surrounding Central Valley counties, refusing to let his daughter's case fade from public consciousness the way so many cold cases do. Debbie's mother, Sarah Loven, carried the emotional weight of the case in a different way. She became a recurring presence at police press conferences over the years, speaking publicly about her daughter and pleading for any piece of information that might crack the case open. She described her daughter's death as the result of an active evil moving through their community, and she carried a fear that never fully left her, that the person who killed Debbie was still out there, still capable of hurting other young women. That fear, as it would turn out, was not paranoia. It was foresight. Community interest in the case would rise and fall over the years, but it never disappeared entirely. Law enforcement periodically renewed public appeals, and the reward for information kept climbing as a reflection of just how badly investigators wanted this case solved. By 2016, 20 years after Debbie's death, the Fresno Police Department and Crime Stoppers had raised the reward to $57,000 for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Still nothing. No name, no face, no arrest. What Sarah Loven didn't know, and what investigators wouldn't fully connect until years later, was that the man who killed her daughter hadn't stopped. He had simply moved 45 miles south, changed his methods, and started again. Between 1999 and 2002, a masked predator began terrorizing the streets of Visalia, a city in Tulare County roughly 45 miles south of Fresno. His pattern was disturbingly consistent, and it was designed for one purpose: control without identification. He targeted young women walking alone, often at night. He would approach them on the street at gunpoint and force them into secluded, dark locations away from public view. To conceal his identity, he wore either a hooded sweatshirt or a handkerchief wrapped over the lower half of his face, enough to make sure that even if a victim survived to describe him, she couldn't identify him, and his victims did survive, though survival came at a devastating cost. One of them, referred to publicly as Jane Doe 1, was just 19 years old when she was ambushed while walking home from her shift at a local ice cream parlor. She would go on to carry the psychological weight of that night for decades. Over the course of those 3 years, this same man committed 4 known violent sexual assaults in Visalia. Each time he escaped without a name attached to him. Each time investigators were left with almost nothing to go on except one thing: DNA. Detectives working the Visalia assaults recovered viable genetic material from the crime scenes, and when that DNA was run through California's state forensic database, something extraordinary happened. It matched, not to a name in the system, but to the unsolved DNA profile recovered from Debbie Dorian's body in Fresno 6 years earlier. The man who had killed a college student in her own apartment and the man terrorizing women on the streets of Visalia were the exact same person. This was the moment the case should have broken wide open. Investigators finally had confirmation that one serial offender was responsible for a murder and multiple sexual assaults spanning 2 counties in 3 years. but confirmation of a pattern isn't the same as an identity. They had his genetic signature. They still didn't have his name, his face, or his address. And now a new problem was creeping toward them, one with a ticking clock attached to it. By the late 2000s, prosecutors in Tulare County were staring down a legal deadline that threatened to make the entire Visalia connection meaningless. Under California law, sexual assault cases carry a statute of limitations, a legal window of time within which charges must be filed, or the opportunity to prosecute disappears permanently, no matter what evidence later emerges. The Visalia assaults from 1999 through 2002 were approaching that expiration date, and the man responsible still had no name. So in 2009, the Tulare County District Attorney's Office and the Visalia Police Department did something unusual, a strategy that would later be recognized as a genuine best practice in cold case prosecution. They filed a formal criminal complaint and arrest warrant not against a named individual, but against the suspect's unique DNA profile itself. A John Doe warrant. It was a legal safeguard built entirely around biology. The filing effectively froze the clock on the statute of limitations. It meant that whenever, if ever, this unidentified predator was finally matched to a name, prosecutors could still charge him for the Visalia assaults no matter how many years had passed. It was a bet on future technology. Nobody in 2009 knew what tool would eventually identify this man. They just knew that if they didn't take this legal step now, any future identification would be legally useless for the Visalia victims. That bet would take another decade to pay off. And when it did, the breakthrough wouldn't come from Fresno or Tulare County at all. It would come from an entirely different case, 400 miles north, that was about to change forensic science forever. In April of 2018, law enforcement in Sacramento arrested Joseph James D'Angelo, the man identified as the Golden State Killer responsible for a string of murders and rapes across California decades earlier. What made that arrest historic wasn't just the case itself. It was the method used to crack it, investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that had never before been used to solve a cold case of that scale. Central Valley investigators working the Dorian and Visalia cases took notice immediately. They already possessed exactly the kind of evidence this new technique required. A high-quality, unsolved serial DNA profile that had been sitting in storage for over 2 decades, waiting for the right tool to unlock it. The process that followed was methodical, and it unfolded across several distinct stages. First, forensic scientists took the suspect's preserved DNA profile, originally captured using older STR technology, the short tandem repeat method common in the 1990s, and converted it into something far more detailed, a high-density SNP profile, mapping hundreds of thousands of individual genetic markers across the suspect's genome. That expanded profile was then uploaded to genetic genealogy databases like GIDmatch and Family Tree DNA platforms, where members of the public voluntarily upload their own DNA to explore family history, and which permit limited law enforcement searches under specific conditions. From there, genetic genealogists began the painstaking work of kinship analysis, identifying overlapping segments of shared DNA, measured in centimorgans, between the unknown suspect and ordinary people who had submitted their DNA for entirely unrelated reasons, like tracing their ancestry. Piece by piece, they built out extensive multi-generational family trees, searching for the branch where all those genetic threads converged. Eventually, genealogists identified common ancestors and traced their descendants forward through history. By layering in additional parameters, geographic location, age range, gender, investigators narrowed an entire family tree down to a single, viable name: Nikki Dwayne Stain, a longtime resident of Visalia, someone who had been living an unremarkable, quiet life in the same community where he'd once hunted women on the street at gunpoint for over 2 decades completely unnoticed. Once genetic genealogy pointed to Stain, investigators didn't move immediately to an arrest. They needed direct confirmation. Surveillance teams discreetly monitored him, and detectives recovered items he had discarded, items containing his own biological material. That sample was extracted, tested, and compared directly against the crime scene DNA from both the 1996 Dorian homicide and the Visalia assaults. It was a perfect match, all of it. One man, one genetic signature, 5 crime scenes across 23 years. But identifying him raised an unsettling question of its own. How had this man managed to stay invisible for so long when his name had never once crossed paths with the police database? Nikki Dwayne Stain worked as a restaurant employee in Visalia, To the people around him, he was ordinary, the kind of person nobody would ever look at twice. That in itself turns out to be a key part of understanding how he evaded detection for so long. Investigators later learned that Stain had a history of minor misdemeanor offenses dating back to the 1980s. Under a different set of laws, that history might have flagged him decades earlier, but because those offenses were classified as misdemeanors, and because they occurred before modern state and federal DNA collection laws were in place, his biological profile was never entered into CODIS, the national DNA database used to match offenders to crime scenes. That gap in the system meant a man with an existing history of violence remained completely undetectable by traditional forensic matching for 23 years. What's especially striking, though, is how Stain's methods evolved between his two documented crime phases and what that evolution reveals about his thinking. In the 1996 attack on Debbie Dorian, Stain broke into her apartment and used extreme prolonged physical restraint, heavy-duty duct tape wrapped around her mouth, nose, wrists, and ankles. It was an indoor private setting, and the level of physical binding suggests a method built around achieving absolute silence and control. Her death by asphyxiation appears to have been an unintended outcome of that method, a consequence of restraint taken past the point of survivability rather than a separate deliberate act. But a homicide investigation carries enormous consequences. It draws intense law enforcement scrutiny, and unlike sexual assault charges, murder in California carries no statute of limitations whatsoever, meaning the case could theoretically be pursued forever. By the time Stain resurfaced in Visalia in 1999, his methodology had changed entirely. He abandoned the time-consuming, high-risk method of physical binding. Instead, he used a firearm to command instant compliance from his victims on the street and concealed his face with a hood or handkerchief to protect his identity. It was faster, lower risk, and specifically designed to avoid a repeat of what happened in that Fresno apartment. In other words, Debbie Dorian's death appears to have taught her killer how to keep hurting people without getting caught again. That adaptation is exactly why it took a technology like genetic genealogy, something that didn't exist in the 1990s or even the 2000s, to finally catch up with him. And on October 3, 2019, that technology did. Visalia police officers arrested Nikki Dwayne Stain on October 3, 2019. He was initially held without bail in Tulare County Jail on charges tied directly to the Visalia assaults. But the case against him extended well beyond Tulare County. In January of 2020, Fresno County District Attorney Lisa Smittcamp and Tulare County District Attorney Tim Ward announced a joint prosecutorial decision. Rather than run two separate trials in two separate counties, Ward agreed to relinquish Tulare County's jurisdiction entirely, consolidating every charge against Stain into a single prosecution in Fresno County Superior Court. In total, Stain faced 11 consolidated counts. The most serious among them was first-degree murder, filed with a special circumstance allegation, murder committed during the commission of forcible rape or sodomy. Alongside that were charges of forcible rape and forcible sodomy, each accompanied by allegations of great bodily injury tied to the Visalia assaults. Given the severity and the special circumstance nature of the murder charge, District Attorney Smittcamp announced that her office intended to pursue the death penalty. The case moved slowly through the court system after that, weighed down by the complexity of presenting forensic evidence spanning nearly 30 years and multiple jurisdictions. On November 28, 2023, the court held a preliminary hearing in Fresno County Superior Court. It was here that Jane Doe 1, the same young woman ambushed decades earlier while walking home from her ice cream parlor shift, took the stand and delivered emotional testimony describing the psychological terror and recurring nightmares she had endured for 25 years. Stain's trial was scheduled to begin the following January, but in the weeks leading up to it in early 2025, something shifted behind closed doors. Prosecutors and Stain's defense team engaged in intensive negotiations, and then, on Thursday, May 15, 2025, 58-year-old Nikki Dwayne Stain made a surprise appearance in court and changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to all 11 charges, including the first-degree murder of Debbie Dorian and every one of the Visalia assaults. His defense attorney, Jane Bolger, later explained that the decision was primarily driven by Stain's desire to avoid a potential death sentence. But she also noted something else, that Stain wanted to spare both his own family and the Dorian family from the trauma of a full trial, one that would have required displaying graphic crime scene and autopsy photographs in open court, alongside distressing testimony from the surviving victims. 29 years after Peter Dorian found his daughter's body, the case reached its final chapter. On June 12, 2025, the court formally sentenced Nikki Dwayne Stain to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will never walk free again. The resolution of Debbie Dorian's case brought a complicated mixture of relief and grief to the people who had carried it for nearly 3 decades. Sarah Loven, who had spent years keeping her daughter's memory in the public eye, finally saw the long wait for justice come to an end, though the absence of her daughter remains, and always will remain, a permanent part of her life. For the surviving victims in Visalia, Stain's guilty plea offered something that had been denied to them for over 20 years: safety, validation, and confirmation that the man who terrorized them would never have the opportunity to do it again. The Tulare County District Attorney's Office publicly acknowledged the survivors' courage, framing the outcome as a message of hope to anyone still waiting for justice in an unsolved case of their own. But beyond the emotional resolution, this case left behind something just as important: a set of hard lessons for modern law enforcement. The first is the sheer difference between early and modern forensic DNA science. The wrongful arrest of Maurice Dixon in 1996 is a stark reminder of how dangerous it can be to rely on low-resolution transitional DNA methods under intense public pressure. Meanwhile, the eventual identification of Stain in 2019 proved something remarkable: that investigative genetic genealogy can reach people who have successfully evaded traditional fingerprint and DNA databases for decades, simply by mapping the family trees connected to their genetic material. The second lesson is the strategic value of that 2009 John Doe warrant. By filing charges against a DNA profile instead of a name, Tulare County prosecutors preserved their ability to seek justice for the Visalia victims years before anyone knew who they were prosecuting. Without that step, the statute of limitations would have permanently closed the door on those 4 assaults, no matter what technology eventually identified their attacker. The third lesson lives in the persistence of 2 retired detectives, Robert Chiotis and Vince Zavala, who kept working this case long after they had any professional obligation to. Cold cases are rarely broken by technology alone. They require people willing to keep the file alive until the science exists to finish the job. And the fourth lesson is perhaps the most uncomfortable one. Nikki Dwayne Stain had a documented history of sexual offenses dating back to the 1980s. Offenses that, because they were classified as misdemeanors and predated modern DNA collection laws, never entered him into the system at all. That gap allowed a man with a known pattern of violence to remain invisible for 23 years, during which he escalated to rape, and, in at least one case, to murder. If you want to see how this exact same technology brought down the Golden State Killer, the case that made all of this possible in the first place, go watch that story next. It's the one that changed everything.
A woman found dead in the snow behind a truck stop. The Wood County case dates back more than 25 years, and police have a suspect.
In fact, detectives believe he's a serial killer linked to the homicides of multiple women.
In August of 2020, Wood County prosecutors indicted Legg for the murder of Collins.
But he will never go to trial for the crimes.
December 20th, 1996. Behind a truck stop in rural Ohio, a worker walking the backlot finds something in the frozen brush. A woman's body, nude, no clothes, no shoes, no purse, no ID. Just a corpse, left in the cold like litter. Investigators would eventually learn her name, Victoria Jane Collins, 27 years old. But naming her was the easy part, because the man who killed her didn't live nearby. He didn't know her, he wasn't from Ohio at all. He was a stranger passing through, and when he drove away from that truck stop, he vanished into the one place American law enforcement in 1996 couldn't follow him: the interstate highway system itself. For over 20 years, investigators knew far more than the public ever did. They knew this wasn't a random, isolated killing. DNA tied Victoria's murder to at least 2 other homicides in 2 other states. They were looking at a serial killer who used the highway like a hunting ground and a truck cab like a getaway car, and they had his DNA the entire time. What they didn't have was his name. The break, when it finally came, didn't come from a new piece of technology or a lucky tip. It came from a cardboard box that should have been thrown away decades earlier. A piece of evidence nobody even remembered was still sitting in a police department storage room. To understand how this case went cold, you have to start with how ordinary the beginning was. Victoria Jane Collins was a dancer living in Cleveland, Ohio, sharing a home with her boyfriend, moving through a social circle centered in Northeast Ohio. She wasn't missing from anyone's life in a dramatic way. She was simply out on a Monday night in December, socializing with acquaintances, doing what a 27-year-old with an active social life does on any given weekend. Sometime after midnight on the drive home, something went wrong. An argument broke out inside the vehicle, and it escalated to the point where the driver pulled over along Interstate 90 near Cleveland and forced Victoria out of the car. On the shoulder of one of the busiest highway corridors in Ohio, in the middle of the night, in December, she was left there. Whoever she'd been with drove off, and that was the last time anyone who knew her personally ever saw her alive. Her boyfriend didn't hear from her that night, and when the silence stretched into the next day, he did the only thing he could do. On December 18, 1996, he walked into a police station and filed a missing persons report. At that moment, this was a missing persons case, nothing more. Somewhere in Cleveland, a man was waiting for his girlfriend to come home, with no idea that 2 days later, hundreds of miles from where he last saw her argue with someone in that car, her body would surface behind a truck stop in a county she likely never had any personal connection to. That gap between where she was last seen and where she was found is the first thread investigators would spend the next 22 years trying to pull. On December 20th, 1996, 2 days after that missing persons report was filed, Victoria's body was found behind the Union 76 truck stop on Libby Road in Lake Township, Wood County, Ohio. This wasn't close to Cleveland. It wasn't close to Interstate 90, where she had last been seen. This was a location built around a completely different kind of traveler. The intersection of Interstate 80-90, the Ohio Turnpike, and Interstate 75, a hub where long-haul commercial trucks refuel, rest, and disappear back onto the road within hours. The body was found behind the paved lot, in an unpaved, semi-wooded strip of land, close enough to be convenient, far enough from the fuel pumps and the diner entrance that no one would notice a man pulling a heavy load out of a truck in the dark. This wasn't a crime of passion committed in a fit of panic. This was a disposal, deliberate, calculated, and chosen specifically because it offered cover. And here's the detail that told investigators everything and nothing at the same time. Victoria's body had no clothing on it whatsoever. No undergarments, no shoes, no jewelry, no purse. No identification of any kind. Someone had either cleaned her before dumping her, or stripped away every possible piece of trace evidence that could connect her death scene to wherever she'd actually been killed. That absence was the loudest clue at the scene. It told investigators the killer understood forensic risk. It told them this truck stop was not where Victoria died. It was simply where she was left. And it told them, without saying it outright, that this almost certainly wasn't the first time this person had done something like this. But underneath that clean, deliberate disposal, the killer had left one thing behind that he couldn't strip away, something that wouldn't matter for another 22 years, but would eventually end his freedom. The Wood County Coroner's Office conducted the autopsy in the days following the discovery, and the findings painted a picture of an intensely violent final struggle. The official cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation, manual strangulation, not a quick death, not an accident. The medical examiner documented petechial hemorrhages in both eyes, the small burst blood vessels that appear when sustained pressure cuts off blood flow from the head. Beneath the skin of her neck, there was deep muscular bruising and tissue hemorrhaging around the larynx and trachea, and in the most direct physical evidence of the force involved, the post-mortem dissection revealed fractures to both the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone, injuries that typically require sustained powerful pressure applied with both hands. Abrasions and contusions on her arms, wrists, and upper torso told the rest of the story. Victoria fought back. This was not a woman caught by surprise and killed instantly. This was a struggle, and she lost it to someone stronger than her, someone who didn't stop until she couldn't fight anymore. The medical examiner placed the time of death between 48 and 72 hours before the body was discovered, meaning she was killed somewhere between December 16th and 18th. Lining up almost exactly with the night she disappeared from that car on Interstate 90. But buried inside all of that trauma was something that would ultimately matter more than any bruise or fracture. During the examination, investigators collected vaginal, anal, and oral swabs. And from those swabs, forensic technicians recovered something the killer never expected to survive: intact, viable spermatozoa. Foreign semen preserved almost perfectly by the one thing working against the killer that night, the freezing December cold, which had slowed the sample's degradation and locked his genetic identity into evidence long enough for scientists to eventually catch up to him. He had left his DNA at the scene. He just didn't know that, in 1996, having his DNA meant almost nothing at all. The investigation fell to the Lake Township Police Department, supported by the Wood County Sheriff's Office and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and the early theory made sense on paper. Whoever was in that car with Victoria on Interstate 90 was the obvious suspect pool. Detectives identified the occupants, brought them in, and pushed hard on their movements that night. But the forensic work and alibi verification cleared them. Whoever had been arguing with Victoria in that car had not killed her. Someone else had. That left investigators with the far more difficult theory that after being abandoned on the highway shoulder, Victoria had either hitchhiked or been picked up by a passing stranger. And in 1996, that theory was close to unsolvable. There were no license plate readers scanning that stretch of I-90. No real-time GPS tracking of commercial trucks. No highway camera network stitching together which vehicles passed which mile markers at which hour. If a stranger in an 18-wheeler had picked her up somewhere along that corridor, there was no digital trail to follow. No way to even generate a list of suspects. Investigators had the semen sample. They had a genetic fingerprint of the killer sitting in an evidence locker. But a DNA profile is only useful if you have something to compare it to. And in 1996, the National DNA Database, CODIS, was still in its infancy, barely operational, with nowhere near the offender profiles it holds today. The killer's DNA existed. His identity did not exist anywhere a computer could search for it. With the boyfriend's associates cleared and no physical trail to a stranger, the investigation stalled completely. Victoria Jane Collins became a name in a file cabinet, and the truck stop became, in the years that followed, just another mile marker on I-8090 where nothing seemed to be happening, except something was happening 2 states away on 2 separate occasions. The exact same man was about to do it again. 10 years passed with the case essentially dormant. Then, in 2006, an automated CODIS search flagged something investigators had no reason to expect. The unknown male DNA profile from Victoria's crime scene matched the unknown male DNA profile from an unsolved 1997 homicide, the murder of 39-year-old Julie Conkle, found strangled behind an abandoned truck stop in Lake County, Illinois. This was the moment investigators learned they weren't chasing a one-time opportunistic killer. They were chasing a man who had done this before, in a different state, using the same method at the same kind of location. A truck stop killer, someone who understood exactly how to use the anonymity of interstate trucking to make himself invisible. And yet, the discovery changed almost nothing practically. CODIS could tell them the same man committed both murders. It could not tell them who that man was. The system only works when a suspect's DNA is already in it, and this man's never was. 6 years after that, in 2012, the pattern widened again. Ohio BCI forensic scientists matched the same unidentified profile to a third homicide, the 1992 murder of 43-year-old Sharon Kedzierski, beaten and left behind a flea market near a truck mall in Austintown, Mahoning County, Ohio. Now investigators were staring at proof of a man who had killed at least 3 women across a 5-year span, 1992, 1996, and 1997, all near truck stops, all along the Midwestern interstate corridor. They knew his genetic signature down to the letter. They had zero idea what he looked like, what he was named, or where on the American highway system he currently was. For a case built entirely on DNA, that was the cruelest kind of dead end, knowing with complete scientific certainty that a serial killer existed. While having absolutely no legal way to put a name to him, that wall would stand for years longer. And when it finally came down, it wouldn't be because investigators found the killer directly. It would be because they stopped looking for him and started looking for his family instead. By 2018, 22 years after Victoria's murder, standard CODIS searches had produced nothing new. The killer had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require submitting his DNA to any database. He was, as far as the system was concerned, a ghost, so the Ohio BCI turned to a tool reserved only for the most severe cases where every conventional lead has been exhausted, a familial DNA search. Instead of hunting for a direct match to the killer's profile, This method searches for partial matches, genetic overlaps close enough to suggest the person in the database isn't the killer himself, but a close biological relative, a parent, a sibling, a child. The search returned a strong partial match. Somewhere in the system was a man who shared enough genetic markers with the unknown killer to almost certainly be his brother. It wasn't a name for the murderer, but it was a thread, and BCI analysts pulled it. Using that familial link, investigators began reconstructing a family tree, cross-referencing birth records, geographic history, and public documentation to map out every male relative of that database match. One by one, candidates were eliminated based on age or location during the murders in 1992, 1996, and 1997. Eventually, the list narrowed to a single name, Samuel W. Legg III, a long-haul commercial truck driver who had lived across northeast Ohio, Lorain, Medina, and Mahoning counties during exactly the years these women were killed. For the first time in over 2 decades, the DNA had a face, but knowing who Samuel Legg III was and proving it in a courtroom were two very different things, and Legg was no longer an easy man to reach. By this point, he was living in a group home in Tucson, Arizona, and his physical and mental condition made a traditional stakeout, waiting to collect a discarded coffee cup or cigarette butt for a discrete DNA sample, extraordinarily difficult. Investigators needed something faster and more certain, and the answer to that problem had been sitting untouched in an evidence room for over 20 years. This is the part of the case that turns an ordinary genealogical breakthrough into something closer to fate. Forensic scientist Becca Salzer began searching historical case files to see whether Samuel Legg had ever surfaced as a suspect in any prior sexual offense, even one that never led to charges. Her search led her to a 1997 file out of Medina County, Ohio, the rape of a 17-year-old girl. Legg had been questioned by police at the time and claimed the encounter was consensual. Without enough evidence to move forward, the case was quietly shelved. No charges, no trial, no conviction. It should have been forgotten. Files like that, from cases that never went anywhere, are often the first things purged when evidence rooms run out of space. But the Medina Police Department had done something that in 1997 felt like routine procedure and in 2019 would turn out to be the single most important decision in this entire investigation. They kept the rape kit. For over 20 years, it sat preserved in an evidence vault, untouched, waiting. BCI retrieved that kit and extracted the male DNA profile from it. When they ran the comparison, it matched directly and unmistakably the same unknown serial killer profile connected to the murders of Victoria Jane Collins, Julie Kunkel, and Sharon Kedzierski. A case with no charges, a kit nobody thought would ever matter again. And it was the very thing that gave investigators the probable cause they needed to obtain a warrant and collect a direct DNA sample from Samuel Legg in Arizona, closing the loop on 22 years of silence. On February 13, 2019, Samuel Legg III was arrested at that group home in Tucson and extradited back to Ohio to face justice for the murder of Victoria Jane Collins. But naming her killer was only the beginning of the next chapter, because as investigators dug deeper into Legg's history, they discovered his violence hadn't started with Victoria, and it may not have stopped where CODIS could see it. Samuel W. Legg III was born around 1969, making him roughly the same age as Victoria Jane Collins. Through the 1990s, he worked as a long-haul commercial truck driver, moving through exactly the region where these murders occurred, Lorain, Medina, and Mahoning counties in northeast Ohio. Investigators eventually connected him not just to the 3 CODIS-linked homicides, but to a 4th tragedy that predated all of them. In July 1990, Legg's 14-year-old stepdaughter, Angela Hicks, disappeared from Elyria in Lorain County. Her body was discovered a month later near the Midway Mall. That case had sat cold for nearly 30 years, until Legg's arrest in 2019 prompted Elyria police to formally reopen it and examine his possible involvement. Layered together, the timeline that emerged was staggering. A suspected homicide involving his own stepdaughter in 1990, the murder of Sharon Kedzierski in 1992, the rape of a teenage girl in Medina County in 1997 that produced the very evidence that would eventually convict him, and the murder of Julie Kunkel that same year in Illinois, bookending the killing of Victoria Jane Collins in 1996. During his February 2019 interrogation in Arizona, Legg made admissions that investigators would later disclose in court. According to Wood County prosecutors, he confirmed picking up Victoria Collins and admitted to choking 3 separate women. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost put it in the plainest terms possible when discussing the scope of Legg's crimes. It's fair to call him a serial killer. On August 19, 2020, a Wood County grand jury indicted Legg on 5 counts tied to Victoria's murder, 2 counts of aggravated murder, 1 count of murder, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of kidnapping. For a moment, it looked like this case, after 24 years, was finally headed toward a courtroom and a verdict. It never got there, and the reason why turns this story from a triumph of forensic science into something far more complicated. During pre-trial proceedings, Legg's defense attorney, Merle Dett Jr., requested a formal evaluation of his client's competency to stand trial. What court-appointed psychologist found changed the entire trajectory of the case. Samuel Legg was suffering from advanced tertiary neurosyphilis, an infection that, left untreated for decades, attacks the central nervous system and produces progressive dementia, memory loss, hallucinations, and physical tremors. Layered on top of that was chronic schizophrenia. Together, these conditions had degraded his cognitive function to the point where he could no longer understand the charges against him or meaningfully assist in his own defense. In September 2019, a Medina County judge ruled Legg incompetent to stand trial, concluding that while his condition might stabilize temporarily with treatment, the underlying decline was irreversible. Under Ohio law, that ruling created a strange kind of legal purgatory. Legg could not be tried because he couldn't participate in his own defense, but he also could not be released given the severity of the charges against him and the danger he represented. The resolution was involuntary civil commitment. Legg was confined to Twin Valley Behavioral Health Care in Columbus, Ohio, a maximum security state psychiatric hospital where he remains today. Wood County Common Pleas Judge Matt Rieger retained jurisdiction over the case, conducting biannual reviews of Legg's mental state. At hearings held on June 5, 2023, and again on May 6, 2025, the court reaffirmed the same finding. Legg's illness remains permanent, and his commitment continues indefinitely. 24 years after Victoria Jane Collins was left behind that truck stop, her killer had finally been identified with total scientific certainty. And yet no jury has ever heard his name read alongside a guilty verdict. No trial has taken place. Legally, Samuel Legg III has never been convicted of anything. It's a resolution that leaves almost everyone unsatisfied. Investigators who spent decades chasing a DNA profile, a justice system that identified its man but couldn't complete the process built to hold him accountable, and a case that proves science can answer the question of who, even when the law can't answer the question of what happens next. Step back from Legg himself for a moment, and this case tells a much bigger story about how cold cases get solved in America. In 1996, DNA testing relied on older methods that needed large, well-preserved samples, and even when a sample was collected successfully, as it was here, there was often nowhere to compare it. CODIS wasn't fully integrated nationally until the early 2000s. A killer without a prior qualifying conviction was, in the system's eyes, invisible, no matter how much biological evidence he left behind. Familial DNA searching changed that equation. Instead of waiting for a killer to appear directly in a database, investigators can now search for genetic relatives already in the system and reverse engineer their way to a suspect through the family tree. It's a technique reserved for the most serious, most exhausted cold cases, and it's exactly what turned a partial match to Samuel Legg's brother into a direct line to Legg himself. And there's a second lesson buried in this case, one that's less about technology and more about discipline. The Medina County kit from 1997 never led to a conviction at the time it was collected. By every practical measure, it was a case that went nowhere. But somebody in that department followed procedure anyway and kept that evidence sealed and preserved for over 20 years without knowing it would ever matter again. That single decision, routine, unglamorous, easy to overlook, is the reason 3 murders eventually got answered. It's a reminder that in cold case work, the evidence that solves tomorrow's mystery is often sitting quietly in a box today, waiting for the technology and the persistence to finally catch up to it. Victoria Jane Collins never got her day in court, but because of the work that finally connected her murder to Samuel Legg III, her case stopped being a mystery. And for a family that spent over 2 decades not knowing, that answer, even without a verdict, was the only kind of closure this case was ever going to offer. If you want to see what happens when familial DNA searching cracks open a case that sat cold for even longer than this one and leads investigators somewhere far stranger than a truck stop off the interstate, the video on screen right now covers exactly that case. Go watch it next. May 4th, 1996, Sitka, Alaska. A 17-year-old girl says goodnight to her sister and steps out onto a quiet bike path for a walk she has made 100 times before. It's a 20-minute walk. She never finishes it. 2 days later, searchers find her body 70 feet off that same path, hidden beneath a fallen tree, across the street from the state's own police training academy. Within 9 days, Sitka police have a confession. A local man is arrested. The town breathes again, but here's the problem: the man they arrested didn't do it. And the man who did was sitting in a jail cell in the very same building for a very similar crime at almost the very same time. It would take 24 years, a discarded coffee cup, and a genealogist tracing a family tree back to the 1850s to finally close the case. This is the story of how Jessica Baggins' killer walked free for over 2 decades and how science finally caught up with him. To understand why this case went so wrong, you first have to understand the place it happened in. Sitka isn't like most American towns. It sits on an island in the Alexander Archipelago, in the panhandle of southeastern Alaska, reachable mainly by boat or plane. In 1996, it was the kind of community where people didn't lock their front doors, where a teenage girl walking home alone after midnight wasn't a red flag. It was just Tuesday. Violent crime was rare enough that when it happened, it didn't just scare people. It broke something in the town's sense of itself. Jessica Baggins was by every account a normal, well-liked 17-year-old growing up inside that sense of safety. She loved the outdoors, went fishing with her family, and had her sights set on studying photography. She had no history of danger, no risky associations, nothing that would have marked her as a target. She was simply a teenager living her life on an island where nothing bad was supposed to happen. On May 3, 1996, she celebrated her 17th birthday with friends and family. That night, or more precisely, in the early hours of May 4th, she stopped by her sister's trailer home off Sawmill Creek Road to hang out with her sister and a mutual friend. At some point after midnight, she decided to head home. Her parents' house was about a mile away, and the route she knew best was a paved bike path running parallel to Sawmill Creek Road, the same path that ran past the campus of Sheldon-Jackson College and directly across from the Alaska Department of Public Safety's own training academy. It was a 20-minute walk. She'd done it before. She never made it. When she didn't turn up the next day, her father, George Baggins, did what any parent would do. He called around to friends and family trying to figure out where she was. When nobody had heard from her, he went to the Sitka Police Department on the morning of May 5th and reported her missing. That single phone call set off one of the most consequential and most flawed investigations in Alaska's history. But before we get to how it went wrong, we need to talk about what searchers found in the woods along the Indian River. Because what happened there would end up being the one thing the investigators got completely right, even while almost everything else fell apart. Search and rescue teams moved into the densely wooded terrain around the Indian River almost immediately after the missing person report came in. On May 6th, 2 days after Jessica disappeared, they found her shirt. Less than 2 hours later, they found her. Her body was located roughly 70 feet off the bike path, hidden beneath the trunk of a large fallen hollowed-out tree. Whoever left her there had tried to conceal the scene, scraping together topsoil, leaves, and forest debris in a hasty improvised burial. It wasn't sophisticated. It was the work of someone who needed to hide a body quickly and didn't have the time or the composure to do it well. Forensic examination confirmed what the scene already suggested. Jessica had been sexually assaulted and killed by manual strangulation. The location told its own story too, a rapid, violent transition from a public, well-used path to a hidden patch of forest just off it, consistent with someone being overpowered and dragged into the tree line in a matter of moments. Now here is where the story gets an unlikely break, the kind of coincidence that would matter enormously 24 years later. At the exact time the crime scene was discovered, 2 senior investigators from what is now the Alaska Bureau of Investigation happened to be across the street, teaching an evidence collection course at the state's training academy. When word came in, they walked straight across the road to help local investigator Dave Tugman process the scene. That meant this crime scene in a small, isolated island town in 1996 was processed with a level of rigor most departments of that size could never have managed. Forensic personnel carefully recovered high-quality foreign pubic hairs from Jessica's body, hairs with a distinct reddish-blonde pigmentation. They recovered semen stains from her clothing and body, and critically, all of it was preserved in frozen storage at the State of Alaska Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory in Anchorage, where the chain of custody would remain unbroken for the next 24 years. In other words, the physical proof of who did this was sitting in a freezer in Anchorage from day one. The technology to read it just didn't exist yet, so investigators did what detectives in 1996 had to do. They went looking for a living, breathing suspect to match against that evidence. And within a week, they thought they'd found one. They were wrong, and the way they got it wrong would end up costing this case more than 20 years. On May 13, 1996, just a week after the murder, a man named Richard Bingham walked into the Sitka Police Department on his own. Bingham worked as a janitor at Sheldon Jackson College and lived alone on a fishing boat in Sitka's harbor. He had cognitive and psychological difficulties, and by multiple accounts he was highly suggestible. A drinking associate had planted an idea in his head that because Bingham sometimes experienced alcoholic blackouts, maybe he had done something terrible and simply didn't remember it. Shaken by disturbing dreams and memory flashes, Bingham went to police not to confess but to ask for help making sense of what was going on in his own mind. What happened next is a textbook case study in how not to interrogate a vulnerable person. The Sitka Police Department, with little to no experience handling a homicide of this magnitude, used the Reed technique, an interrogation method built on psychological pressure, minimization, and maximization designed to extract admissions of guilt. Investigators told Bingham that physical evidence already placed him at the scene. That wasn't true. They suggested that if he'd done something while blacked out from alcohol, confessing now, framing it as an accident, was his best and only path to leniency. For a man already anxious about his own memory, already convinced by a friend that he might be capable of something horrific, this was enough. Bingham agreed to a series of statements, which investigators then assembled into what looked on paper like a confession. He was arrested on May 15, 1996, just 11 days after Jessica's murder, and charged with rape and murder. For a town desperate for an answer, this felt like resolution, but it wasn't one. And the moment Sitka police locked onto Richard Bingham as their man, they stopped looking anywhere else. That single decision would let the real killer walk free in plain sight for the next 24 years, because at almost the exact same time Bingham was being interrogated in a Sitka police station, another man, a local mechanic, was already known to that same department for an entirely different, eerily similar crime. His name wouldn't mean anything to the public for another 24 years, but it should have meant everything right then in May of 1996. Bingham was held for 13 months in a jail in Juneau, where his trial was eventually moved due to the intensity of local media coverage and community bias back in Sitka. When the trial finally happened in early 1997, it collapsed almost immediately. His public defender, Galen Payne, dismantled the state's case by exposing exactly how that confession had been produced. The coercive tactics, the false claims about physical evidence, the vulnerability of the man giving this statement, and there was something else working against the prosecution. The physical evidence didn't match. STR-DNA comparison between Bingham and the crime scene profile came back a complete mismatch. The jury acquitted him after just 2 hours of deliberation. Sitka got its answer and then had it taken away. Worse, the case now had nowhere to go. The state had built its entire theory of the crime around Richard Bingham. When that theory fell apart in a courtroom, there was no backup plan, no secondary suspect list actively being pursued. The investigation didn't just stall, it had actively burned a year chasing the wrong person while the right one lived his life a few miles away. And this is the part of the story that, once you know it, is almost impossible to sit with calmly. Because in June of 1996, while Bingham was being coerced into confessing to a crime he didn't commit, a local mechanic named Steve Allen Branch was arrested for the violent, forcible rape of an 18-year-old coworker at a local C-Mart grocery store. His blood was drawn as part of that prosecution in part to check for HIV. That blood sample went into state custody, which means for a period of time in 1996, Alaska state authorities were physically holding two things in the same case ecosystem: Steve Branch's blood and the unidentified semen profile from Jessica Baggins' murder. Nobody ordered a comparison between them. Branch was ultimately acquitted of the C-Mart assault in 1997. He argued the encounter was consensual, and he simply continued living in Sitka for over a decade, working as a mechanic, blending into the same small community he'd terrorized. He wasn't a stranger lurking at the edge of town. He was a known quantity, a name that had already crossed police desks in connection with a strikingly similar act of sexual violence in the exact same year, in the exact same town. So why wasn't he cross-referenced? Why wasn't his DNA ever compared to the Baggin crime scene evidence? The answer to that question is uncomfortable, and it involves someone much closer to the investigation than anyone expected. Here's a detail that didn't come to light until true crime researchers and journalists started digging through public records years later. Nick Ward, the lead detective on the original 1996 investigation, was married to one of Steve Allen Branch's sisters. Think about what that means. The lead investigator on Jessica Baggin's murder was, by marriage, family to the man who actually killed her. There's no public evidence that this was some deliberate cover-up. Nothing suggests Ward knowingly protected his relative, but it raises an obvious and uncomfortable question about institutional blind spots. How thoroughly do you investigate someone who sits inside your own family tree? How likely are you to circle back and cross-check a brother-in-law against a decade-old charge, especially once you already believe you've solved the case? Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. Branch was never seriously scrutinized in connection with Jessica's murder. He wasn't hiding. He was working in Sitka, living an ordinary life, while over 100 other local men had their DNA collected and screened out, a net so wide it even included the son of Dave Tugman, the department's own primary investigator on the case. More than 100 men were tested and excluded, and the one man whose blood was already sitting in a state evidence locker, arrested for a nearly identical act of sexual violence in the very same year, was never checked at all. This is what criminologists call cognitive anchoring. Once investigators commit to a theory, they stop actively pursuing evidence that contradicts it, and they stop looking hard at anyone who doesn't fit the narrative they've already built. Sitka PD anchored to Bingham in the first 2 weeks. Once that anchor was set, Steve Allen Branch simply never registered as a threat, despite being in hindsight the most obvious kind of suspect there was. For the next 2 decades, that's exactly where things stayed. Frozen. Literally, the evidence sat preserved in an Anchorage freezer, and figuratively, as the case slipped from an active investigation into one of Alaska's most notorious unsolved mysteries. But it didn't stay frozen forever, because while Sitka's police department moved on, one person never did. George Baggins spent the next 2 decades doing everything in his power to keep his daughter's case alive. He stayed in regular contact with local police. He funded independent investigations. In 2000, he hired private forensic scientist Brent Turvey, who partnered with former NYPD investigator John Biza to conduct an independent review of the case files and physical evidence, operating under a special commission from Sitka's police chief at the time. Their involvement wasn't without controversy. Turvey later sued the city over a police memo that questioned his credentials, litigation that dragged on for over a decade, but it reflected something important. This case never had the luxury of being quietly forgotten, because Jessica's father refused to let that happen. Meanwhile, the town itself never fully let go either. On May 12, 1996, just days after the murder, roughly 1,500 people, more than a third of Sitka's entire population, gathered for a memorial walk through Sitka National Historical Park and a candlelight vigil near the site where Jessica's body had been found. Local author John Straley would later call it the largest outdoor demonstration of community support he'd witnessed in over 45 years living there. Institutionally, the case moved in fits and starts. In 2007, the original Sitka detective, by then working as an Alaska State Trooper lieutenant, reopened the file and reviewed past suspects. But in 2015, Alaska's Cold Case Investigation Unit was shut down entirely due to budget cuts, halting active work on Jessica's case along with dozens of others across the state. It would take 2 more years and one specific investigator's return before the case started moving again, and before the technology finally caught up to the evidence that had been sitting in that Anchorage freezer since 1996. In 2017, Alaska's Cold Case Investigation Unit was re-established, and investigator Randy McFerrin was rehired to take control of the Baggin case file. By May of 2018, McFerrin had identified a method, that just a few years earlier hadn't even existed as an investigative tool: forensic genetic genealogy. Here's the fundamental difference between what investigators had access to in 1996 and what they had access to in 2018. Traditional forensic DNA testing, RFLP, and PCR-STR analysis, the methods used at the original crime scene, compares a small number of specific genetic markers. It's incredibly effective for confirming or excluding a known suspect, but it's essentially useless if you don't already have someone to compare against, especially in an era when the National CODIS database was still in its infancy and didn't contain profiles for most ordinary people. Genetic genealogy flips that entire approach on its head. Instead of comparing a handful of markers, it uses single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP, genotyping, analyzing over 1 million individual genetic variation points across the genome. That density of data doesn't just tell you if two samples match. It tells you how two people are related, even if they're only distant cousins who've never met. In September 2018, Lance Jameson Ewers of the Sitka Police Department worked with McFerrin and the Alaska State Crime Lab to send the preserved 1996 crime scene semen to Parabon Nanolabs, a private forensic genomics company. Parabon successfully built a detailed SNP profile from that decades-old sample, proof that the careful preservation work done back in 1996 hadn't just survived, it had survived well enough to power technology nobody in that era could have imagined. In February 2019, that digital profile was uploaded to two public genetic genealogy databases, GDmatch and Family Tree DNA, and almost immediately the search returned something investigators had never had in 23 years: actual leads. Several people in those databases shared small segments of DNA with the unknown killer. They weren't the killer, they weren't even close relatives, they were distant cousins sharing only fragments of a family tree that stretched back generations. That's not a solved case. That's a starting point. And turning that starting point into a name would fall to one specific analyst, someone whose job over the following months looked less like modern forensics and more like painstaking historical detective work. Patty Busby, a criminal intelligence analyst with the Alaska Department of Public Safety, took the DNA matches from GDmatch and Family Tree DNA and began building backward. The process worked like this. Those distant cousin matches all shared some amount of DNA with the unidentified killer, which meant they were all connected to him somewhere on a family tree. Busby's job, alongside a genealogist at Parabon, was to find where those branches converged. Working methodically through public records, she and her colleague traced the connections all the way back to a single ancestral couple who had lived in the 1850s. From that 19th century starting point, they reversed the process, mapping forward again, generation by generation, reconstructing every branch of that family tree as it grew across more than a century and a half. By the time the tree was fully built out, it included thousands of living descendants scattered across the country. Obviously, you can't investigate thousands of people, so Busby cross-referenced the entire family tree against one specific narrowing detail: which of these descendants had documented residency in Sitka, Alaska in May of 1996. That single filter dramatically shrank the field. But even then, there were gaps, branches of the tree, where the genetic and genealogical trail went cold, where public records simply didn't say enough. So Busby did something almost old-fashioned in the middle of this high-tech investigation. She started making phone calls. Cold calls to distant relatives, trying to fill in the blanks. Most people hung up on her. That's what you'd expect when a stranger from a state crime lab calls asking about your family history in connection with an unsolved homicide, but one person didn't hang up. One relative agreed to help and convinced an elderly family member to make their own genetic profile public on the database. That single elderly relative's public DNA profile acted like a precision compass. It gave Busby the missing coordinates she needed to narrow an entire family tree of thousands of descendants down to one specific branch, one specific family, the Branch family. By December 2019, more than 23 years after Jessica Baggins' murder, investigators had a name: Steve Allen Branch, the same man who had been arrested for a nearly identical sexual assault in Sitka in 1996, the same man whose blood had been sitting in state custody since that arrest, the same man who had somehow never been cross-checked against the case that genetic genealogy had just spent over a year working to point directly at him. Now they had a name. What they didn't have yet was proof strong enough to make an arrest. Getting that proof would mean tracking down a man who had left Alaska behind entirely, and it would take a strategy investigators hadn't planned on needing. By 2019, Steve Allen Branch was no longer in Alaska. After his acquittal in the C-Mart assault case, he had stayed in Sitka for over a decade before relocating permanently to Austin, Arkansas. In 2010, a small rural town outside Little Rock. In January 2020, investigator Randy McFerrin reached out to the Arkansas State Police for help with something deceptively simple: obtaining a discarded DNA sample from Branch without alerting him to the investigation. Genetic genealogy had pointed to him, but pointing isn't proof. Investigators needed a direct biological sample to confirm the match before they could move forward. Discarded items, something thrown away in the trash, left behind in public, don't carry the same legal protections as a person's body, which meant surveillance teams could legally collect and test them without a warrant. But Branch's property outside Little Rock was isolated, and his public activity was limited. Weeks of surveillance in Arkansas came back empty-handed. So investigators pivoted to a second angle, one much closer to home. If they couldn't get a sample from Branch directly, they could get one from someone who shared his DNA. Sitka Police Department officers, under Lieutenant Jamison Ewers, identified a close relative of Branch still living in Sitka and began monitoring them. Over the course of 3 weeks, officers legally recovered a discarded biological sample from that relative. The Alaska State Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory sequenced it, and Parabon ran the comparison against the original 1996 crime scene profile. In May 2020, the results came back: a first-degree biological relationship, not a distant cousin, a parent, sibling, or child-level match. Combined with everything the genetic genealogy work had already built, this was as close to certainty as investigators could get without Branch's DNA directly in hand. They now knew with extremely high confidence exactly who had killed Jessica Baggin 24 years earlier. But knowing isn't the same as confronting. And 2020 had one more obstacle waiting: a global pandemic that would delay the final step of this investigation by several critical months. COVID-19 travel restrictions pushed the investigation's endgame back until early August 2020. Finally, investigators from the Alaska Bureau of Investigation flew to Arkansas. On August 3, 2020, they arrived at Steve Allen Branch's home in Austin, Arkansas, and confronted him directly. Branch denied knowing Jessica Baggin. He claimed to have no memory of the 1996 murder, and when investigators asked him to voluntarily provide a DNA sample, he refused. Faced with that refusal, the detectives did what the law required. They left to go secure a search warrant that would compel a sample regardless of his cooperation. Approximately 30 minutes after they drove away, Steve Allen Branch shot himself. The Lonoke County Sheriff's Office in Arkansas confirmed his death was a suicide. Investigators still executed the search warrant, not on a living suspect, but during his autopsy, collecting a post-mortem blood sample. On August 10, 2020, the Alaska State Crime Lab compared that sample against the 1996 crime scene profile using standard STR analysis, the same fundamental technology that had failed to identify Branch back in 1996, except this time they finally had the right name to test it against. It was a complete, unambiguous match. On August 11, 2020, 24 years, 3 months, and 1 week after Jessica Baggin's murder, the Alaska Department of Public Safety officially declared the case solved and closed by exception. Amanda Price, the commissioner of Alaska's Department of Public Safety, addressed the resolution publicly, acknowledging its bittersweet nature directly. Branch would never face a jury for what he did, but Jessica's case could finally be called solved. She emphasized that every cold case represents a grieving family still waiting for answers, and that no amount of time makes a case any less of a priority. Major Dave Hansen of the Alaska State Troopers laid out the scientific path that led to that resolution during a public livestream, walking through the discovery of the shirt, the recovery of the body 70 feet off the bike path, and the confrontation in Arkansas that ended with Branch taking his own life just 30 minutes after investigators departed. Randy McFerrin, the investigator who had pushed for genetic genealogy back in 2018, was direct about who actually solved this case. 2 genealogists, one at Parabon and one at the Alaska Department of Public Safety, Patty Busby, whose painstaking family tree work had finally pointed investigators in the right direction after 2.5 decades of dead ends, and Galen Payne, the public defender who had once fought to clear Richard Bingham's name, offered perhaps the sharpest assessment of the whole case. She pointed out that the effort to build a case against Bingham had actively distracted investigators from pursuing Jessica's real killer and asked the question that still lingers over this entire story. If Steve Branch wasn't a suspect in 1996, why the hell not? He was clearly on their radar at the right time. Or should have been. For George Baggin, who had spent 2 decades funding investigations and refusing to let his daughter's case fade into memory, the resolution brought a version of closure, tempered permanently by the fact that the man responsible would never stand trial, never have to answer for what he did in front of a jury of Jessica's community. If this case pulled you into how genetic genealogy is rewriting what cold case even means, it wasn't a one-off. Alaska used this exact same method to crack the Sophie Sergi case and the Shelley Connolly case, 2 more murders that sat unsolved for decades before a family tree cracked them open. I've broken down that story too. And it's just as unsettling as this one. Go watch it next, because once you see how this technology works, you start to understand just how few unsolvable cases are actually unsolvable anymore. March 10, 1991, Spring Hill, Tennessee. A man walking near Saturn Parkway stops cold. Just off the wood line, 100 feet from the Port Royal Road off-ramp, lies the body of a woman. Her clothes are torn. Her neck bears the unmistakable marks of a struggle for life that she lost. She has no name, no ID, no one waiting for her, as far as anyone in Spring Hill knows. What the medical examiner discovers next changes everything. This woman was 24 weeks pregnant. Her unborn daughter died with her. For nearly a month, she is simply a Jane Doe in a Tennessee morgue, and the man who left her there is already gone, driving an 18-wheeler down another highway in another state, becoming someone else's problem before Tennessee even knows her name. It would take 34 years, 3 states, 2 more bodies, and a piece of pantyhose kept frozen in an evidence locker to finally catch him. This is the story of how a mobile killer stayed invisible for 3 decades, and the science that finally found him. Before she was a case file, she was a person. Pamela Rose Aldridge McCall, friends called her Rose, grew up in Topping, a small coastal town in Middlesex County, Virginia. She was 33 years old, though for years afterwards, secondary reports would get her age and even the length of her pregnancy wrong. It's the primary charging documents and the Tennessee medical examiner's own records that settle it. 33 years old, 24 weeks pregnant. Rose lived a life that was hard to pin down. She moved constantly between Virginia and Tennessee, and she did it the way a lot of people without steady means did back then. She hitchhiked. She had a son and a brother back home, people who loved her and who would spend decades not knowing what happened to her. In early March of 1991, witnesses place her at the Union 76 truck stop off Interstate 65 in Middle Tennessee. She's seen getting into a semi-truck, riding with an unidentified male driver. It's an ordinary moment, the kind that happened 1,000 times a day on America's interstates. Except this time, it was the last time anyone would ever see her alive. That single detail, a woman getting into a truck cab with a stranger, is about to become the thread that connects 3 murders across 3 states. But in March of 1991, nobody in Spring Hill, Tennessee has any idea a pattern even exists. All they have is a body and no name to put on it. When investigators reached the wood line off Saturn Parkway, the evidence told a brutal, fast story. Rose's clothing, including her undergarments, had been torn from her body. Her face and neck showed severe trauma. The autopsy would later confirm what the scene already suggested: manual strangulation, homicide, because of where the body was found, right beside the westbound off-ramp for Port Royal Road. Detectives formed a working theory. They believed she'd been attacked inside a truck cab and that her body had then been rolled down the embankment near the ramp. It was a theory, not a confirmed fact, but it fit everything else they knew: the truck stop sighting, the trucker companion, the location. Then came a decision that nobody in that moment could have known was the most important one of the entire 34-year case. Technicians recovered Rose's pantyhose. On it, they found traces of seminal fluid. In 1991, there was no real way to use that evidence. The DNA technology to analyze a sample that small simply didn't exist yet. But instead of discarding it, someone made the call to freeze it and preserve it. That single piece of fabric sealed away in a police evidence freezer would end up outliving witnesses, outliving careers, and outliving the killer's ability to hide. But that payoff was 30 years away. In 1991, all Ron Coleman and his team had was a strangled woman, a truck stop lead that led nowhere, and a killer who was already 3 states down the highway. Officer Ron Coleman caught the case, and almost immediately he hit a wall that had nothing to do with effort. For nearly a month, the victim herself was unidentified. She lay in the morgue as a Jane Doe until April 9, 1991, when a fingerprint match finally gave investigators a name: Pamela Rose Aldridge McCall. With a name, Coleman could trace her movements, the hitchhiking route between Virginia and Tennessee, the sighting at the Union 76 truck stop, the unidentified trucker. He interviewed truck stop employees. He interviewed transients who passed through the area. He interviewed drivers who ran that stretch of I-65 regularly, and then nothing, no vehicle description, no license plate, no local suspect who fit. The killer wasn't from Spring Hill. He had no ties to the town, no reason to come back, and by the time McCall's body was even identified, he was long gone, invisible to a small-town police department. With no way to search beyond its own jurisdiction, Coleman made a personal promise to Rose's mother that he would not stop until her daughter's killer was found. It's the kind of promise investigators make when they still believe the case is solvable in months, not decades. But the months became years. The leads that existed dried up completely, and in 2002, Coleman retired as assistant chief of the Spring Hill Police Department with that promise still unfulfilled. The case was officially cold, but while Spring Hill's investigation stalled, something else was already happening 1,000 miles away, something nobody in Tennessee could have connected yet, because the man who killed Pamela McCall wasn't finished. To understand why this case took so long to break, you have to understand what was happening on other highways in other states, all while Tennessee investigators worked in isolation, just weeks before McCall's murder. In February of 1991, a 21-year-old hitchhiker named Mary Ann Newton was picked up in Wheeler County, Texas. She was bound, raped, and choked inside the sleeper cab of a commercial truck. Newton fought back and managed to escape at a gas station. Her attacker was arrested, but the case fell apart when her trauma made it impossible for her to return to Texas and testify. He walked free. Then, in the fall of 1991 into early 1992, an unidentified woman, later nicknamed Bitter Creek Betty, was assaulted and strangled in Sweetwater County, Wyoming. Her body was found frozen and nude along Interstate 80 in March of 1992. Just weeks after that, in April of 1992, Wyoming highway patrolmen discovered another body, a mummified, pregnant woman in a ditch along Interstate 90 in Sheridan County. She became known only as I-90 Jane Doe. 3 women, 3 states. All connected by highways, all encountered by a driver moving cargo across state lines, and not one police department had any reason to believe these cases were related. Wheeler County worked its case. Spring Hill worked its case. Sweetwater County and Sheridan County each worked theirs. There was no shared database, no phone call linking Texas to Tennessee to Wyoming. Each agency was staring at one piece of a puzzle none of them knew existed. It would take 21 years just for 2 of those pieces to connect, and even then it would be a match between bodies, not a name. In 2012, the Wyoming State Crime Lab ran DNA profiles recovered from the Bitter Creek Betty and I-90 Jane Doe crime scenes against each other. They matched. Same unknown male offender. For the first time, someone had proof this wasn't 2 isolated murders. It was one man killing along 2 different interstates, but a match between 2 unidentified crime scenes still isn't a name. Wyoming now knew they were hunting a single serial killer. They still had no idea who he was, and they had no idea he'd already killed in Tennessee too. That connection, the one that would blow this case wide open, wouldn't come from new violence. It would come from an old piece of evidence that had been sitting in a freezer since 1991, waiting for the technology to finally catch up to it. In April of 2019, the Spring Hill Police Department made a call to the 22nd Judicial District Attorney's Office requesting help reopening the McCall case. Since 2014, that office had run a dedicated cold case initiative that had already cracked several old homicides. Investigator Tommy Getz took the lead. Getz's first move was simple but crucial: find the physical evidence from 1991. He tracked down the frozen pantyhose and submitted it to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Forensic Chemistry and DNA Unit, using modern short tandem repeat or STR amplification. Technology that didn't exist when Rose died. TBI scientists pulled a clean, full DNA profile of an unknown white male from that decades-old sample. They ran it through CODIS, the National DNA Database, and they got a hit. The DNA from Rose McCall's pantyhose matched a profile Wyoming investigators had developed years earlier, the same profile connecting Bitter Creek Betty and I-90 Jane Doe. In an instant, a cold Tennessee homicide from 1991 was revealed to be part of a multi-state serial killer's trail spanning at least 3 victims in 2 states. But CODIS could only tell them the same man did all 3 murders. It couldn't tell them his name. For that, investigators would need to go further than any database, into the killer's own family tree. With the FBI now coordinating, Tommy Getz and Wyoming's Division of Criminal Investigation brought in a private lab to run investigative genetic genealogy, IGG. Instead of searching a database of criminal offenders, IGG maps hundreds of thousands of genetic markers and searches public genealogy sites where ordinary people upload their own DNA to learn about their ancestry. Somewhere in that public data, without knowing it, the killer's own relatives had left a trail back to him. The genealogists built out a family tree, branch by branch, narrowing an entire population down to one plausible name, Clark Perry Baldwin, born August 22, 1961 in Charles City, Iowa, raised in Nashua, Iowa, graduated high school in 1979, and went almost immediately into a career as a long-haul commercial truck driver for Martin Transport, a job that put him on exactly the highway corridors where 3 women had died. Investigators now had a name. What they needed next was proof solid enough to survive a courtroom. And to get it, they wouldn't ask Baldwin for a DNA sample. They'd have to take one without him ever knowing. In April of 2020, FBI surveillance teams began quietly watching Clark Perry Baldwin in Waterloo, Iowa. They didn't approach him. They didn't tip him off. They waited for him to leave something behind. At a local Walmart, agents watched Baldwin use a shopping cart, and after he walked away, they retrieved the handle. They also collected trash from his household waste. Both samples went to the Wyoming State Crime Lab for STR analysis. The result, a perfect match to the DNA recovered from Pamela McCall's pantyhose and to the DNA from both Wyoming crime scenes. 3 murders, 1 man. Nearly 30 years of running. On May 6, 2020. Investigators Tommy Getz and Loy Young knocked on the door of Baldwin's 6th-floor apartment. It took him 4 minutes to answer. When he did, he let them into a room with nothing but a single couch. Over the next hour, wearing concealed recording devices, they spoke with him. He denied remembering McCall by name but admitted he may have had sex with her, adding that she was a prostitute. He showed no visible emotion. Only after that recorded conversation did Getz read him his Miranda rights. Clark Perry Baldwin was arrested on first-degree murder warrants from both Tennessee and Wyoming. 34 years after Pamela McCall was left in the woods off Saturn Parkway, her killer finally had a name attached to handcuffs. But an arrest isn't a conviction, and getting Baldwin in front of a jury would take 5 more years. The case landed in Maury County, Tennessee, where Baldwin was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Pamela McCall and a second under Tennessee's fetal homicide statute for her unborn daughter. District Attorney General Brent Cooper led the prosecution. Getting to trial took until 2025. 5 years of pretrial motions challenging the legality of that Walmart cart and household trash DNA, pandemic-related court shutdowns, and the sheer logistics of moving decades-old evidence between 3 states. When the trial finally began in April 2025, prosecutors leaned on 2 pillars. DNA evidence that TBI analysts testified was, for all practical purposes, conclusive, and the testimony of a woman who had survived him. Marianne Newton, the same hitchhiker Baldwin had attacked in Texas back in February 1991, took the stand. She described being bound, gagged, and choked nearly to death in his truck, and recounted a moment that silenced the courtroom. Baldwin handing her a gun and telling her, "If I were you, I would shoot me." The defense pushed back, arguing McCall's contact with Baldwin was a consensual paid encounter, and that the state couldn't prove he was the one who strangled her, suggesting someone else could have done it after he left. The jury didn't buy it. On May 2, 2025, Clark Perry Baldwin was found guilty on both counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. It should have been the end. It wasn't, not quite. Baldwin still owed Wyoming an answer for 2 more murders. In the week following his conviction, Wyoming's Division of Criminal Investigation publicly named the I-90 Jane Doe victim, Cindy Arlene Estrada, identified on July 17, 2025. Bitter Creek Betty had already been quietly identified back in 2022 as Irene Vasquez. Though that information had been kept sealed, Baldwin was set to be extradited to Wyoming to finally face charges for both of their deaths. He never made it. On July 18, 2025, one single day after Estrada's name was made public, Clark Perry Baldwin died of a heart attack in the Maury County Jail. The Wyoming cases would never see a courtroom. The full truth of his final hours with Irene Vasquez and Cindy Arlene Estrada died with him. For McCall's family, the ending was bittersweet in the truest sense. Her mother had lived to see her daughter's killer identified and arrested in 2020. She once told District Attorney General Brent Cooper, "At least I have a grave to visit. Some moms don't even have that." But she passed away before the 2025 trial, never hearing the guilty verdict read aloud. Rose's brother and son were there in her place, and after the verdict, they thanked the Spring Hill Police Department and the Maury County community for never letting the case die. Strip away the decades and the states and the courtroom drama, and this case comes down to one decision made in 1991. Someone chose to freeze a piece of evidence they had no way to use yet, just in case science ever caught up. It took nearly 30 years, but it did. This case also exposed something uncomfortable, that a man with no felony DNA record, no CODIS profile, and no ties to any of the towns where he killed could drive right past justice for 3 decades simply by staying in motion. It wasn't until investigators stopped searching criminal databases and started searching ordinary family trees, the same public genealogy sites millions of people use for curiosity, not justice, that his own relatives unknowingly led police straight to him. Wyoming never got its day in court with Clark Perry Baldwin. Irene Vasquez and Cindy Arlene Estrada are still, in a legal sense, waiting for justice that will now never come in a courtroom. And there's still one name true crime forums keep bringing up in connection with Baldwin: Tammy Jo Zwiecki, the Illinois college student who vanished off Interstate 80 in 1992. Investigators looked hard at Baldwin for that one too. What they found and why they ultimately ruled him out is a story on its own if you want to know how that investigation played out, and why some cold cases stay cold even after the killer is finally caught. That's the video to watch next.